Okay, welcome. We're only up here because that's where they put us. That's it. We have done nothing to deserve this. I'm speaking for myself. The rest of this August bunch may belong here, but I'm just here because this is where they put me.
So when we approach the bench, we have to say, Your Honor?
You do. Everybody else.
Objection overruled.
Okay, and I see Julie's in there. Great. So we'll start off. Welcome to Boulder, actually almost Boulder. Thanks to everybody for coming. It's good to look out and see non-CSMAC people here as well as CSMAC people. That's basically all the opening remarks I have. Anything else for anybody else on the stage here? I take that as a no. So let me start just with my comments. First of all, thanks to everybody for showing up. We're tagging this at the beginning of our ISART, or the ISART conference, which I always look forward to. This one is about millimeter wave, so there's a lot of good panel discussions and presentations about that, so I hope everybody can stick around for that. And thank ITS for keeping this going for us here in Boulder. So thanks also to the co-chairs for getting your materials in on the deadline. That always makes it helpful. I'm sure Dave and the folks within Ntia really appreciate that, as does the public that reads this. There's a fair amount of work that's been done so far, and so thank you all for doing that. And today's meeting is really to kind of check in where we are. Some people have submitted recommendations. Others are in the midst of discernment, let's say, doing surveys and whatnot. So we're hopeful to check in, provide any guidance. You guys are facing each other, so you can help each other out. And we on the dais will listen and enjoy. So having said that, the other thing I will just remind you of, because I like to do this every now and then, tomorrow is the anniversary of Elvis Presley's death, 40 years, so don't be blue. So having said that, let's go ahead and do any other comments? Unit comments? Okay. How can you follow that up, right? Yeah, and Glenn will be doing remarks for ITS, and Glenn is, where is Glenn on this? NTIA. Should I give Glenn now? Glenn.
Thank you. And I'm really going to keep this short and not sort of get into the usual high-level opening comments. I do appreciate, NTIA greatly appreciates you all being willing to come out here, willing to get out of D.C. in August. But it is important. It's helpful for us. We hope that there are synergies between the work that CSMAC is doing and the efforts and the focus of ISART this year. As I'm sure you all are aware, ISART is going to be very much focused this week on millimeter wave bands. The discussion, the talk, all of the policy engagement in D.C. on 5G has moved forward, I think, faster than certainly any of us in the government side have expected. And I think we are all trying to figure out how we, if not stay ahead of the curve, try to keep up with what you all are doing in the industry so that the policy and spectrum needs that for you all are not being dragged down by the slow processes going on on the policy on the government side. Relatedly, I guess I would sort of address the elephant in the room briefly. Just to emphasize that despite the fact that we at NTIA continue to be without a political appointee, I can assure you that the work that you all are engaged in remains critically important and will be used and emphasized and studied by both the folks, by the career staff, and by the political leadership that we fully expect will get on board in the near future. Things are continuing to move, as you can imagine. There are decisions that need to be made. There are policies that need to be thought about, and we are continuing to engage both within the department and with folks over at the White House. As you all know, Grace Coe is over there, and Kelsey Geiselman is now over at OSTP, and we're working with them to keep the trains moving until we have our new political leadership on board. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for coming out here, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts today.
Thanks, Glenn. One bit of housekeeping, actually two bits of housekeeping. One, for all the CSMAC people, please remember to say who you are when you speak. and if you don't, one of us will remember. That's for the transcript. And for those on the phone, please be sure to mute unless you're speaking. That always causes some weird feedback. It's kind of cool to listen to, but it really screws up the meeting. So if you would just please adhere to the protocols when you're not in the room, that'd be great. Now we're on the point where we'll do the roll call. So let's start with Brian and go clockwise.
Brian Tremont, Wilkinson, Barker.
Mark Raycheck, Erickson.
Steve Sharkey, T-Mobile.
Carl Povolitis, AT&T.
Paul Colazzi, Colazzi Consulting.
Dale Hatfield, University of Colorado.
Alan McKenzie, Virginia Tech.
Dennis Roberson, Illinois Institute of Technology, and Roberson and Associates.
Robert Weller, National Association of Broadcasters.
Yeah. Turn that face to camera.
No extra charge.
Donna Bethay Murphy and Marcel.
Michael Calabrese, Technology Institute.
Carolyn Kahn-Miter.
Rick Reitzer, Raytheon.
Mary Brown, Cisco.
Audrey Allison, Boeing. I also have a billboard.
Cool.
Paul Aniskevich, CTIA.
Wachowski, Freedom Technologies.
Okay, and then for those CSMAC members on the phone.
Charlotte Rath, Verizon. Mariam Saran, Dish Network.
Andrew Lloyd, ASLRI.
Jennifer Warren, Lockheed Martin.
It was Jennifer. Okay. Anybody else?
Llewellyn, John Deere.
Okay. Any other CSMAC people on the phone? Okay. Good. So that's the roll call. We'd like to acknowledge our very special guest, Julie Knapp, the head of the OET. Julie, welcome. Thanks for being here. Any other special guests? That's it? I think so. Okay. If you're special and you're here, and you want to be a guest, just let us know.
If you are here, you're special.
If you're here, you're special. Yeah. Special people. Okay. Now we're ready for the Spectrum update page.
Good morning. I'd like to echo Glenn and Mark's welcome today. This is the third CSMAC meeting of the year as well as the current term, and we're lucky to have this alongside with the ISART conference. So I hope that everybody can participate. And I asked this last year, does anybody actually know what ISART stands for? And ITS can't answer. Okay. International Symposium on Advanced Radio Technologies. Last year it was the students that I think answered. It was Dale's students. So the ISART topic is very relevant. We've mentioned millimeter wave, but it really is a conference about information exchange, brainstorming, collaboration. And that's really pertinent to what we are discussing today. It's not just the topic, but then that deliberation, collaboration that gains us the biggest bang. So I appreciate everybody being here, and I hope many of you can stay for the actual conference. It will be an exciting one, lots of good panels and keynote speakers, including one that's in the audience. So I recognize that the current CSMAC schedule has been aggressive for the meaty topics that we've teed up for your deliberation. And I expect today we'll have a pretty robust discussion around some of the preliminary results and findings to date. And it's really important that we have that robust discussion as we move toward hopefully final recommendations toward the end of the year. So I encourage you to vet and discuss during this morning. And before we dive into the primary focus for today, which is the subcommittee updates and discussion, we're going to have a slightly expanded Spectrum update. Not only my normal Spectrum update, but we will ask Julie to provide an update on the FCC's Technological Advisory Council, if I got that right, the TAC activities, as well as ITS. Mr. Mike Cotton will give us an update on some of the ITS relevant activities to the topics that we're deliberating here. So on to our update. So we collectively continue to make steady progress across all fronts, from AWS-3 transitions to making 3.5 gigahertz and frontiers bands a reality, as well as looking at new options. And I'll mention the mid-band NOI a little bit later. And by the way, when I give you my update, I want to emphasize this is a collective update. It's not just an NTIA update. And all the hard questions go to Julie.
Twice a special guest.
Yes. I just want to keep the momentum going. So NTIA recently published their 10th annual report to Congress as required by the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act, or CSEA, describing the progress of the federal agencies in transitioning out of not just the AWS-3 band, but also the AWS-1 band, which we're still reporting. We also recently published or posted on our website an AWS-3 transition status report providing the completion status for the federal AWS-3 assignments transitioning relative to their original schedule and the transition plans. And the intent here is to create better transparency into our progress, to relocate systems, or to share bands. So I would encourage you, if you haven't seen those reports, take a look at them, but it's a good source of information on the progress for our transitioning activities. Now, work on 3.5 continues, the 3.5 gigahertz band, and it's really been a great collaborative effort with government and industry stakeholders making steady progress on implementing this innovative sharing and licensing approach embodied in the Citizens Broadband Radio Service. And equipment providers are pioneering hardware for the band, and we continue to hear plans from service providers and carriers, big and small, for a host of applications. So it's really an exciting area. And NTIA, working in collaboration with the Commission, the DoD, and the wireless industry, particularly the Wireless Innovation Forum, or WIN Forum, are finalizing a certification system and process to test compliance of both the spectrum access systems, the SAS, as well as the environmental sensing capability, the ESC. And we are working with the ESC applicants to define dynamic coastal protection areas, DPAs. And that's to replace the static exclusion zones as we have traditionally defined. And these DPAs will only be activated when the sensing capability senses that there is a military radar in the area and it's detected. So it's a different way of approaching the problem and hopefully moving us closer to dynamic sharing in the future. So the majority of the effort over the last few months has been focused on completing the WIN Forum standards that will be used as the basis for the SAS and ESC FCC certification. And the initial SAS certification is expected by the end of this calendar year, and the initial ESC certifications are expected the first quarter of 2018 on the current schedule. Meanwhile, it's been a little over a year since the FCC released the Spectrum Frontiers Report and Order and further notice. The use of these millimeter wave bands for 5G has sparked a great deal of interest, as all of you are aware. And this ISARC conference is very well timed to continue that dialogue in this, I'll call it, quote-unquote, new spectrum, which just a few years ago was thought infeasible, really, for some of these emerging mobile applications. And as you know, the interest in millimeter wave bands for 5G doesn't stop at the border. Delegates to the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, technical meetings also are examining the compatibility of terrestrial broadband services with incumbent services, both in the Frontiers bands as well as other bands above 24 gigahertz. We just had a successful CTEL meeting, and for those of you unfamiliar with CTEL, it is Region 2 in ITU speak, and think of it as the Americas. And Region 2 is pushing forward with the sharing and compatibility studies needed to accommodate wireless broadband technology in the millimeter wave bands. And again, in ITU speak for the conference, it's agenda item 1.13, if somebody mentions that. And as you know, NTIA is intimately involved in developing the federal and U.S. positions for these meetings in close collaboration, again, with the Commission, Department of State, the agencies, and the industry. And we look forward to working with many of you to prepare for the next World Radio Communications Conference, which is now just over 2 years away. And though our national priorities for the conference continue to evolve, Agenda Item 1.13, this item in particular, which covers broadband in bands above 24 gigahertz, remains a top priority for the U.S., and that's not going to change. So both domestically and internationally, there remains much work to do in pioneering sharing in millimeter wave bands. For example, NTIA is working with the Commission and soon with the agencies to explore workable sharing approaches in the 37 to 37.6 band. And we will also be working with the Commission and others to evaluate the additional bands in the further notice. And they actually raise some interesting challenges from a coexistence or sharing perspective. And I think that really highlights the need for a strong technical foundation to feed the policy decisions that we make in this band as well as others. And we will continue to work with the Commission to make sure rules are in place for the spectrum to be available, especially for those bands that will be shared with federal users. And though there's been a great deal of focus on millimeter wave, the Federal Communications Commission recently launched a new inquiry seeking comments on ways to expand opportunities for next generation services in mid-band spectrum between 3.7 and 24 gigahertz. And this new notice of inquiry seeks comment on 3 specific non-federal bands and asks commenters to identify other mid-band frequencies that may be suitable for expanded flexible use. In parallel, NTIA continues to leverage our own interagency processes, the Policy and Plan Steering Group, the PPSG, as well as the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee, the IRAC, to assess other opportunities for increased commercial access in bands used by the federal agencies. And that's especially, we're looking at sharing scenarios. And as we collectively continue to build the pipeline of spectrum to meet increasing commercial as well as government requirements, spectrum efficiency and sharing will continue to be key elements to our success, reinforcing the continued importance and urgency of the work that this committee is doing for NTIA, so we are very appreciative. We also continue to work with the federal agencies to explore the strengths and weaknesses of various incentive mechanisms intended to result in efficient and effective federal government use. We have engaged ITS to conduct initial research on how to technically define spectrum efficiency in the federal agency context. And for those of you that have been involved in this discussion over the last 15 or 20 years will know that's not an easy problem to tackle. We are also assessing how the agencies make decisions regarding spectrum use from the very earliest stages of defining mission and system requirements through operational deployment. And these results will help us identify the gaps in our knowledge, processes, and tools so we can start closing that gap or those gaps and provide the necessary tools that help the agencies make better spectrum efficient decisions. And we also are very much looking forward to the CSMAC recommendations coming out of your effort, looking at perhaps other policy recommendations that we should consider to promote efficiency over time and move the ball forward. So as I've mentioned before, we strongly believe one of the most effective incentives are ones that give the agencies the necessary research to look at alternatives in terms of other ways, other spectrum or other techniques, as well as upgrading to more efficient spectrum technologies. The Spectrum Pipeline Act of 2015, which we've talked about in prior meetings, broadened the scope of eligible expenses covered under the Spectrum Relocation Fund, or the SRF. And we continue to see agencies seeking pipeline funds to create opportunities for increased spectrum access for commercial users. And for example, and we talked about this at the last meeting, FAA, DOD, DHS, and NOAA are jointly assessing the opportunity or possibility of consolidating and relocating long-range, short-range, and weather radar systems to potentially free up a portion of 1,300 to 1,350 megahertz for commercial access. and it's called the Spectrum Efficient National Surveillance Radar, or sensor. That program was the first pipeline plan approved by the technical panel and notified to Congress, and that occurred in the January timeframe, and the program is well underway. The Sensor Joint Program Office is currently reviewing responses to a request for information, and they plan to wrap up their assessment on the RFI responses by the end of this month. And that at that time, they will be able to better understand the technical risk of the program and whether any adjustments to their program are necessary. But again, that's well underway. So that's the first program that was born out of the Pipeline Act. Also, since our last meeting, a second pipeline plan has been approved and notified to Congress, and that will study the potential for sharing in the 1675 to 1680 megahertz band currently used by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, for meteorological satellite and radiosonde operations, radiosondes being the weather balloons. And I anticipate the transmittal of additional agency pipeline plans, transmittal through the technical panel and OMB to Congress over the next few months. As we continue to make progress, Congress has also been working on several related bills, as you are aware, such as Mobile Now and the recently introduced Airwaves Act, that, if enacted, could influence our efforts fairly significantly. However, we're confident that our activities will yield good results, our current activities, and build a solid pipeline of spectrum over time. So before I wrap up, I want to mention a couple of other items. Following up on a recommendation from the previous CSMAC cycle, we are continuing to plan a workshop, ideally by the end of this calendar year, that will look at bidirectional sharing, and that means different things to different people, but particularly we're interested in the potential for federal users to access non-federal spectrum, and that this, again, was a topic for discussion during the last CSMAC cycle. And our goal is to have a substantive discussion with industry around specific use cases of interest to federal users. That's been the challenge. How would the federal users anticipate using non-federal spectrum? What are the use cases, to help us figure out the viability and the methods by which you would do that? So stand by for more information, and again, hopefully we'll have that by the end of this calendar year. And in collaboration with the Commission, we are planning a series of workshops that will focus on spectrum enforcement. And by that, I mean not necessarily the traditional definition of enforcement, but the whole scope of prevention, detection, and resolution. And as we move to more intensive use of spectrum and more spectrum sharing between federal and non-federal users, all parties really need to have confidence in the enforcement regime that reduces the risk of interference to acceptable levels. Our initial workshop is going to be for the federal agencies only, to share best practices, exchange information, understand current concerns, but we look forward to extending this outreach to industry in particular in the near future. And again, our initial workshop will be sometime hopefully within the last quarter of this calendar year, again, for the federal agencies. So 2 areas that we're following up with, largely based on the CSMAC recommendations. So before I turn the microphone over to Julie, let me congratulate the subcommittees. There's been a great deal of engagement within the subcommittees. And again, these are meaty issues, and I know we've been on a compressed schedule, so I really appreciate everyone's contributions and work. I know it's not easy. And can't emphasize enough, we appreciate that you all are volunteering your time to do this, to help us. And it is important for us to get your feedback and your recommendations so we can make better policy decisions over time. And it really does result in a world-leading spectrum policy and promoting the U.S. economic and technological leadership while ensuring the U.S. government can also fulfill its missions for our citizens. So I encourage all of us to take advantage of this meeting and the clean mountain air to engage, deliberate, and collaborate and hash out as much as we can, again, as we look at moving toward the end of the year for final recommendations. I know in some cases that may be challenging, so think about final recommendations as well as potentially topics to tee up for the next year following. And with that, I'm happy to take questions, or we can turn it over to Julie and do questions toward the end after both the TAC update and the ITS update.
No questions for Paige? Really?
They're saving them.
I have a comment. I'd just like to comment on the work that's being done for 3.5 gig CBRS, SAS, and ESC certification, just to say that I won't speak for industry, but I reckon industry shares the sentiment that the collaboration has been amazing. There are a lot of surprises, and I think we expected them, but I think just the level of commitment across the government, DOD, Navy, NTIA, ITS, has just been really awesome. So thank you, and let's hope it sets up the framework for moving forward in shared band situations. Janice.
Let's see. This was a kind of a shout out to NTIA. We've finally caught up with the research that NTIA was doing back in 1989-90 when I was assistant secretary, and I came out to ITS, and they were doing millimeter wave research, basic, first and only in the world at that point. I thought I might have to investigate because I kept getting these travel vouchers for trips to Hawaii. I said, what's this dude from ITS doing in Hawaii? They said, ideal circumstance for studying rain attenuation. Yeah. So glad, you have to be grateful that I bought off on those vouchers. But no, he did do the breakthrough research. And when I hear about the breakthroughs that are finally coming to market, I do want to extend that compliment. Cool. I don't know that it's really appreciated sufficiently. Thank you.
No other questions? Okay, Julie needs to be at a mic. Take Dennis's mic, that's always good.
Mark was going to order that anyway, so.
Nobody heard that. Whoops.
So I'm not going to be on camera. That's a good thing.
Well, they have the back of your head, really.
Who was that talking head, anyway?
Is that on? Is his mic on?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. So thanks. And, we may be sitting at opposite ends here, but actually on all these issues that Paige discussed, we sit side by side and working through some very tough problems to come up with good solutions, I think, for the country. So there were a couple of things I did want to add, just ditto to everything that Paige said. It perhaps has been no busier time on Spectrum. I started to think about all of the different things that we're doing. If I went into all of them, we'd be here a long time. I'm just going to touch on a few others. So Paige mentioned the NOI on the mid-band spectrum. And also the next day, the Commission issued an NOI on 900 megahertz and how we could make more efficient use of that band as well. Though the work is continuing on the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding. Both the bands where we had petitions for reconsideration and the bands that we had in the further notice. And there's been interest above 95 megahertz, and we're trying to do some work to flesh out exactly what kinds of rules we might propose there. The incentive auction teams, led by Gene Cadu, they're hard at work implementing the TV incentive auction, and it yielded 84 megahertz of spectrum for wireless broadband services. And at the same time, we've got a proceeding, as Bob well knows, to consider providing for ATSC 3.0 on a voluntary basis. So there's a lot of work going on there. We've completed the phase 1 testing of the unlicensed sharing at 5.9 gigahertz with DSRC. We're busy analyzing the results and preparing a report. We also have a proceeding that was considering additional allocations and licensing provisions for NGSO satellites, so we're doing work on that as well. There's quite a few others. I'm sure I'll leave out your favorite one, TV white space reconsiderations, and the reserve channel proceeding, the Legato proceeding, of course, the 4.9 proceeding, the higher ground reconsideration, etc. So lots of things going on the spectrum front. So let me just say a few words about the TAC. To start with, I want to recognize Dennis Roberson's leadership of the TAC. We wouldn't be where we are without all of his fine work. Dale also participates on the TAC. We've had liaisons between the TAC and the CSMAC so that the work is complementary. The TAC, it's a little bit larger than this group, I think. We've got 45 active TAC members, and there's about 120 additional work group members that span roughly 70 entities. Many of your organizations have other representatives who've either been members of the TAC or have been working with the TAC. And you know, the thing that we always charge the TAC with is coming up with actionable recommendations. We may not be able to do everything that the TAC recommends, but it really has played a key role in so many of the things that we're doing. You know, everything from the work on Spectrum Frontiers really had its root on our side in the TAC. The work on 3.5 was sparked there and so forth. So a lot of terrific ideas have come out of there, and we've actually implemented them. So I'm not going to go into all of the work that the TAC is going. I'm just going to highlight a few things that I think may be relevant here. One group that we called from last year, Future Game Changing Technology, had recommended that the FCC should institutionalize a process for anticipating and keeping up with major shifts in technology usage and patterns. I am not going to tell you the response because we have a meeting coming up on September 19th. And so this is just a teaser for the things that you'll probably be hearing about. It also called for balanced spectrum allocations, that we should work closely with the administration, NTIA, and Congress to ensure a flow of spectrum that's balanced across high, middle, and low spectrum bands for commercial use, and promote flexible use policies that support experimentation. Many of you may know that just earlier in the year, we made available program licenses, much greater flexibility now in conducting experiments. Out of the Spectrum and Receiver Performance Group, one of their recommendations was that the FCC direct our lab to measure advanced lighting and switching power supplies on the market to ascertain if they meet regulatory noise limits and initiate enforcement if not, and to also issue a notice of inquiry / notice of proposed rulemaking to gain more information about the advisability of rule changes to deal with advanced lighting and switching power supplies and to reduce noise in the spectrum. The emitters are both government and non-government, and so we're all in this together. So the question is, you know, by most accounts, the noise floor is rising, and you know, when I've talked to the group, I've said, well, don't just tell me the noise floor is rising. What do you think are the leading contributors, and what should be done about it? There was a lot of work that went on in that group as well in developing a policy statement on spectrum. And it recommended that the FCC consider it, and I'm just going to go through quickly some of the points in there: formalizing and implementing the tax receiver recommendations and spectrum allocation principles and policies, to adopt risk-informed interference assessment and statistical service rules. So many of our standards right now are based on worst case as opposed to truly evaluating, well, how big is the risk and what would happen if there were an adverse consequence. To implement the steps outlined by the TAC for Improving Enforcement. I know that there's been work going on here as well, and as Paige mentioned, trying to work jointly on that, particularly as we do things like at 3.5, where we've got sharing across systems, and that's to include a next generation enforcement architecture to create a public database of past enforcement activities and incorporate interference hunters. They haven't made the TV show about them yet, but we all think it's pretty exciting. And some of the topics that we're working on right now, we've continued to do a lot of work on mobile device theft prevention, and we've got a group that's working on identifying technical rules that perhaps should be eliminated or no longer necessary and outdated. So they've got some ideas of what to do there. We've also got a group working on broadband deployment technology challenges, more from the technical side than the policy and infrastructure deployment side. Another group working on the implications of next generation TV broadcasting satellite, not satellite, TV broadcasting technology. And we've also got a group that's continued to work on satellite systems and so forth. So I will stop there, and any hard questions I'm going to turn back over to Paige.
Okay. Any questions for Julie? Bob.
Julie, can you elaborate a little bit on the status of the laboratory testing of advanced lighting systems and power supplies? Have you actually got devices? Are they being tested?
So it's like wine. No wine before it's time. There's work going on. Stay tuned. We'll have more to say as this unfolds.
Okay.
Any other questions for Julie? Boy, this thin mountain air has really made you all smello. Cool. Okay, cool. Yeah, really. I think Paige said, let's be liberated. Was that the word? So here comes Mike Cotton speaking for Keith Grimban.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to speak with CSMAC. I wanted to note that I made the last trip to Hawaii on the rain attenuation measurements, so it was really fun to hear about that, research into that. So the need for additional spectrum to support consumer applications is growing. And last year, ITS presented at CSMAC in the research projects that we work on towards spectrum sharing. The research topics were in three major areas. One is in spectrum monitoring, one is in radio wave propagation modeling and measurement, and one is in electromagnetic compatibility studies. So I'm here to basically provide a delta on that and talk a little bit about what we've accomplished in the last year. So for spectrum monitoring, our spectrum monitoring project continues to develop tools and best practices and technologies to enable wide area continuous monitoring of spectrum use. Our goal is to demonstrate cost-effective sensing and sensors, software to integrate across multiple sensors, and also user interface technologies for exploring the data that's acquired. Last year at ISART, we spoke about spectrum forensics, and I stood up and said, in collaboration with NIST Gaithersburg, we are releasing a capability, a monitoring capability called MSOD, which stood for Measured Spectrum Occupancy Database. Only 2 months after that public release, we determined that really the approach taken there and the assumptions in the development of that it made it too big to scale. Basically, the application was too big, too integrated, crossed over too many disciplines for any organization to really host it. They would require an IT team, a RF engineering team, a software architect team, and so forth. So we went back to the design board this year, and we've broken it up. We've re-architected it. And the focus of this year's work in spectrum monitoring has been at the sensor manager / sensor network level. And what we're trying to do there is basically, not provide a full solution, but provide sensing as a service so that RF engineers can develop and install this type of network and basically make a profit off of the data. And then on the data client side, the data clients would come to this sensor manager and basically say, okay, go to the website, what is your sensor network capabilities? Get those capabilities. How are the sensors that are out there deployed scheduled for measurements? What kind of data? And hey, I'd like to have some of that. And basically that enables a data distribution model where data clients can work on the data visualization and the data mining part of that. So on the sensor development side of that, we have deployed a number of sensors along the coast to measure the 3.5 gigahertz space. We're going to start reporting to OSM on a monthly basis on those to kind of get our connection with OSM going with monitoring. I should also say we've prototyped a cheap sensor that costs about $5K. We're building about 20 of those guys. And we're going to be deploying that in and around Boulder this year. So the goal for the Boulder deployment is to prototype an automated spectrum enforcement system in Boulder. And so I'm very excited to hear about the initiative here at CSMAC. I really hope to participate in the workshop and basically share in the discussion. But our approach is to start with a baseline understanding of the RF environment in Boulder and then understand where there are changes from that baseline. Man-made noise certainly is something that's changing. So we can identify the trends in changes like that and also changes from the baseline and have that trigger workflows. And that's kind of what we're doing towards automated enforcement. We're hoping that this is really the foundation or a foundation for testing experimental licenses and testing out new technologies in a real-world environment. So we're hoping to have that baseline understanding of the RF environment for that. Okay, for propagation measurement and modeling, we've been working in this space for a long time, and we continue to advance state-of-the-art through a number of internally and externally funded projects. DSO and OSM has us focusing on characterizing propagation in cluttered environments, environments where radio wave propagations are moving through man-made structures and foliage and so forth. So we've been going into a number of different environments: Arizona, LA, Los Angeles, Denver, and we're moving to North Carolina next month, I think. Some of those measurements have been published in IEEE Military Communications Conference and last week at the IEEE EMC Conference. In addition to the measurements, we're really attacking these things from first principles too. ITM was released in 1965. IF-77 was in the 70s. Those code bases are old, and the authors are not on staff. So
That's a good way to put it.
we have maintained the expertise, but what we're doing on an approach for modernizing these tools is we have formed an ITS propagation focus group. And our focus there is to develop these models from first principles. This year, our focus is on air-to-ground propagation. We're focusing on the IF-77 model, which needs to be re-architected. DSO is interested in it, as well as OSM. So literally, 40 lectures to get from Maxwell's equations to all the work, all the models that go into the algorithm that is IF-77. I suspect there's a lot of work to publish this, still to be done. The material has grown, and next year I suspect we will produce an algorithm paper on IF-77 similar to the algorithm paper that is associated with ITM. We are also not just driving our measurement vans into these most complicated environments. We're also doing simple propagation measurements out at Table Mountain, where we're measuring canonical geometries, single knife edge diffractions, measurements through single walls, a wall with a window. We're trying to kind of validate those core pieces of our propagation models, see if we can do things numerically to generalize those things and make our models more general. And then finally on propagation, I want to just say that we are working to improve the usability of those tools via software best practices. So this year we published an official version of the eHATA model, which WinForm has been using for 3.5 gigahertz SAS developments. We are establishing a modern software infrastructure and framework for the development and testing of our propagation models, and we're involving OSM with that. So it's not just our experts throwing together engineering code and getting that done. We now are establishing a muscular storage behind this so that we're data-driven in our predictions. We have an API on top of the data to gear the interface with that so we can query that data in a uniform way. And we have a QA environment which we're going to have both ITS testers, OSM testers on before it gets to public release. We're hoping that that will actually grow to the ITU community and even broader, because similar to the way GNU Radio is to software-defined radio and all that, where we really feel like ITS is in a position to establish a community around propagation modeling and measurements. And so we're trying to do that with software best practices. Electromagnetic compatibility, this is a difficult problem that we continue to work on. There's it's a matrix problem with all kinds of input parameters to these problems. Also, there's the black box problem where we don't really know what's going on inside the devices under test. Over the last few years, we've focused more on simulation capabilities rather than testing the boxes, and that's beginning to bear fruit. We have been focusing on characterizing the IPC of radar systems, specifically for Spin 43, which is the 3.5 gigahertz incumbent. And then also we're looking into solid state radars and interference in and out of LTE systems, which are kind of the most important systems these days. I shouldn't say that, but which are important systems these days to consider. The other thing that I just wanted to mention on the EMC side is the aggregate problem. We've started working the aggregate problem in 2016 in the AWS-3 scenario, where we were modeling via Monte Carlo simulations aggregate emissions from smartphones on an uplink scenario where the incumbent is the NOAA METSAT station. So we've moved that this year and advanced that in a number of ways. We have advanced the layout of transmitters such that assumptions like uniform spatial distribution is not the assumption put down there. We found out via measurement that that's not a good assumption to make. We are looking at TDD systems, which is relevant to 3.5, where up and downlink both operate in the same band. We are also executing on evaluating heterogeneous transmitters, which again is we're moving our aggregate modeling towards 3.5, and we're trying to advance that to make sure that we can be smart about certification and so forth in that space. And most importantly, in the aggregate thing, we're working to validate. I mean, we've been modeling and running these simulations and try to make it go faster. We haven't gotten to making some measurements to make sure that it's right. And so we are getting to work on that and making progress there. And we're also working to do sensitivity analyses so that we're investigating, what are the strongest contributors in the aggregate emission modeling model, and do we need to do this extensive, Monte Carlo simulation, or can we just cut to the chase and work towards modeling those strongest contributors? So just one more minute. I'm not sure if I'm on how much time I have. So in addition to the work supporting spectrum sharing, we have a number of other projects that are working to advance radio science and developing tools that will be needed in the future. We continue work on quality of experience. In the past, we have set the bar for doing subjective evaluation of audio and video when subjected to background noise and interference. We continue, I mentioned about the software. I was talking to Dennis earlier about this. Software is becoming an important part of our output. It's not just publications. We are using GitHub software repositories as another publication mechanism for us. So we have developed an Ntia or ITS policy that we're hoping to be an NTIA policy in terms of software release, so that spectrum monitoring can make available sensor software that people can pull from. These propagation models can be available to the public. IoT, we're working on getting a test bed going in there to evaluate, what it means when these huge numbers of devices are on, and we're looking to model that and measure what type of noise floor increase would happen there. We are working for DOD, DOT, DHS, Coast Guard, NOAA, and even DARPA these days, kind of on the sharp end of things. So I just wanted, again, I'll take any questions, but one thing, too, I wanted to say with Julie is I've been in contact with Bob Pavlak and talking about a lot of your work on TAC. I think Bob and I are trying to work out a deep dive with you guys in late September, because I think that a lot of the spectrum monitoring infrastructure that we're building, I think you guys, we should compare notes on a little bit. So
he's coming.
Yeah, I hope so.
Derek, want to make, or Glenn, want to make a comment?
Sort of an advertising message for a second. First of all, for those of you who don't know Mike is the head of our theory division in ITS. He's been in that role for about 2 years and has been doing a great job. I think last year, ITS, we had to go back to Congress for the first time ever and ask Congress to raise the ceiling on the amount of reimbursable work that we can do, and which we did, which is just showing the kind of aggressive work that Mike and Keith and Rebecca and all the ITS folks have been doing. Particularly in, frankly, what I guess would understatedly say an extremely challenging budget environment. I think if any of you all have any interest in the capabilities of ITS, what we can do, what type of work we can do, a lot of our work on the CRADA basis. Mike's a great guy to talk to. Keith will be around this afternoon. Rebecca's here. Other folks are here. But I also I think we would like to hear from you all, just informally, just as part of conversations, what type of work is the most important for the industry going forward? What should we be focusing, what I can say are very limited resources right now, particularly in our budget funding as opposed to our reimbursable funding? Because as we are evaluating our options right now, we're actually going to have to make some difficult decisions on where to focus our efforts. And so understanding from you all what is the most important types of work that we can be focusing our resources in over the next couple of years would be extremely helpful.
All right, thanks, Glenn. Couple questions, Rick?
Rick Reeser from Raytheon. One thing you've talked a lot about, sort of looking at interference, IPCs and stuff like that. Have you guys kind of come up with some ideas about what is interference and what categorizes it? Like, what is the definition of interference to these things, and how do you determine whether that's interference or it's a nuisance or whatever? I think that all these things are really, really important that you're doing, but the fundamental issues, and it goes back, we probably don't want to define what harmful interference, so I'm not going to go down that path, but at some point you need to have kind of a metric. Okay, this is kind of a reasonable man about, okay, if this is happening, yeah, you're being interfered with, now we need to decide what we want to do about it, if anything. So that's the other thing. And by the way, each radio service kind of has its own kind of sets of of things that you worry about that are different between a radar and a broadcasting and versus, other kinds of things. I have speckles on my TV, and I realize that's not wireless. Probably wireless at some point it is, but all the ones that go off my modem through my other parts of my house do. But I'm not necessarily bothered if I miss a few pixels or lose a few words. Is that harm? Is that what is have you thought about that? What's the definition?
Yeah, I think that the one thing about IPC simulation is that you're in kind of the error rate space, right? And there's really, and that's good to quantify that. You can do things because it's a big matrix problem that you can get to that way. But yeah, if you don't get the human element into the measure, then it's really difficult to get to that final assessment. And what happens in there for us is when it becomes a priority to test this service or that service or the other, then we will bring it to the lab. We'll put whatever the human interface is for that system, and we'll look at it. And we have there's the Q quality of experience group that we have that will help us assess what type of quality that is in a subjective way, and we can even do it objectively by bringing in testers as well. So it's a big question, and I think, but that's you're right. I think that's the bottom line. If you don't get to that bottom line answer, then you can always just argue about those error rates and things like that forever.
Sort of a follow-up to that research.
Make it brief if you would, because we got 3 people online. So thanks.
The other thing is, have you started looking at statistical ways of looking at that as well? I've been involved with some of these things where it happens once in a billion years, and if it happens once in a billion years, it's harmful interference, which is kind of ridiculous. And sometimes the scenarios of these corner cases rarely happen. I'm talking about the L-band GPS thing I was involved with for like literally 20 years. So, but some of these things, so statistical. Are you looking at statistical things in terms of determining whether there's interference?
Yeah, I mean, we don't usually go. There's an economics sort of element to this whole thing. There's also systems these days are more adaptable. LTE networks can, if they have interference in a space, they can adapt and go at it in a different way and things like that. So yeah, I mean, we recognize that there are these statistical means. There's risk assessments that should be done in a probabilistic way. I think that's something that kind of needs to be addressed as a community and engaging with us to some degree.
Just to add, so as we have progressed with 3.5 and other scenarios, we have moved toward a statistical approach in terms of looking at potential for interference, the protection zones, et cetera. So we are moving in that direction. There's still a lot of work to go.
Okay, so we've got Dennis, Dale, Bob, Michael. You in, you're out, Paul, and then Paul. So, and we've got like 10 minutes. So if I can ask you, just implore to keep it brief and succinct, I'd appreciate that. Thank you. Dennis?
I'm going to tie several things together here.
There goes my name.
But this interference one, just following up on Rick's point, and really it's Glenn's point of what can ITS do for you. I think this really is an extraordinarily important issue. We keep dancing around it as a community, and we have danced around it for years. We've got Pierre de Vries, with his harm claims threshold and so on, but we never quite nail this one down, and it is a logical extension off the propagation work. Okay, so you propagate, then what? So I really,
propagation is probabilistic too. I mean, it's
yes, indeed. But getting much further along that path would be enormously helpful, because we get into all of these issues, and with our sharing, these things have amplified tremendously. The boundary issues, in the TAC, we've been at this for a decade, maybe more, 2 decades. So we really could use some significant leadership, I think, out of ITS to help us in that space. It's just an enormous issue that spends all kinds of time with the commission trying to sort these things out, and well, enough. You said to keep it short, but it's a huge one for your consideration. The other one that also ties into the funding, there is this funding for ITS itself, but there is NASTN now. And you are part of NASTN, but you're not. And could you, or maybe Glenn, speak to how you are seeing NASTN these days with its testing? Because it's certainly come along and has become a major thrust and done some significant studies at this point. But how is that going, and how do you see the relationship, and how do we think about that in terms of your funding? Because NASTN seems to have a model for funding that's independent of the ITS model, and where do we go for this and where do we go for that? Is there some definition you could provide?
I'll give a quick answer, and I'll defer to Keith. You know, the NASTN is something that we've been working as part of. There are costs associated with actually participating in NASTN, and the types of work that NASTN is going after are not always the same types of work that we're in a position to engage in. So we're trying to figure out how NASTN fits within the ITS model, and we can have a further discussion about that offline. But it's a challenging situation. Again, it's partly because of the budget situation and the fact that we.
Yeah, that's why I addressed it here, because it fit right in what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's so with the amount of, it takes resources. It takes money to make money. It takes resources to invest in order to be in a position to do a certain amount of work. And we're trying to figure out, again, Dennis kind of going to the ultimate question that we're literally working on as we speak is where do we put those limited investment dollars, both as far as budget money and in personnel, and do we direct them in that direction or in other directions? And that's something we're literally in the process of trying to figure out how best to utilize those resources.
Great.
All right, thanks, Dennis. Dale?
Well, I was just going to say that I really support what...
Can pull the mic down there? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Dale Hampton. I just want to support what Rick said and add just a little bit. And I'll read from something I wrote here very recently. Like many localities in Boulder, we have an automated speed limit enforcement system. But how can you automatically decide to issue someone a speeding ticket if you don't establish the applicable speed limit itself? So it really is fundamental to what we're doing. And then associated with that, it seems to me that there's two sides to this. One is when you're looking at interference to a government radar, and we need to do something kind of immediately and get it fixed. And then there's the issue, I want to go back and issue a notice of apparent liability, or I want to seize somebody's equipment, because that gets you into an enforcement area that's sort of different than what you do right when you're first sensing it. And I don't think those distinctions maybe have been explored as much as they could. I could go on, but this is an area that I feel very, very strongly about. But I'll let it just stand then.
Thanks,
for
Dale.
those 2 points.
Bob?
I probably don't need a microphone. Michael, thank you for the excellent presentation. I would echo the comments of others concerning the importance of your work relating to interference. I'm kind of a propagation geek, and the ESSA data banks that data were collected in the 1960s and 70s formed a data bank that I and many others have used for validation of propagation models. Is your current work something of similar scale? Month-long projects all around the country. The previous work was, as I understand it, CW, fixed frequency operation over a fairly wide range. But are you now looking at wideband propagation models and with the related extended parameters? We're talking about the spectrum frontiers, so measurements above 10 gigahertz, say, clutter. Can you expand just a little bit more on what it is that you're doing?
Sure, I appreciate that. Let's see. So right now, we have been marching out these propagation measurements. They are primarily CW type measurements. This year, with OSM, we've brought back our pseudo-noise random code impulse response measurement, which is a more wideband type of measurement, and we're doing comparisons alongside. So you can, there's some subtleties in comparing those two data sets, and we're doing that. So yeah, I mean, one thing that's been great. Let's see, in terms of scope, I mean, we don't. I talked about opening up the software into a test environment. We really haven't made any of the data accessible. So we are basically driving to internally to advance the ITS models. So we haven't gone there yet. Did I touch everything there?
That's helpful. I don't want to take any more time, but I want to emphasize there's interest and it's important, and thank you for doing it.
Okay, thanks. We have 4 minutes and 2 people, so it's 2 questions per. And I really want to make sure we have plenty of time, the allotted amount of time for the subcommittee reports. So Michael and then Paul.
Okay. Yeah, it should be 2 quick questions here. One is...
it's my job. Keep us on time.
Pardon?
Nothing. Keep going.
Your propagation measurement and modeling, is it... it sounds like that could be incredibly valuable, but I'm wondering, are you focusing in any particular place? In other words, is this focused on millimeter wave, or are there particular bands that you're focused on? And the other is, you mentioned the aggregate emissions problem. You're focusing on the 3.5 band. Is that in relation more to fixed satellites or to the Navy?
Yeah, I missed that. So we are focusing our clutter measurements on shared bands. So 1.7 and 3.5 is where we're measuring those. We have a collaboration with the University of Colorado where we have a link to measure. It's way up at like 280 gigahertz. Measure propagation up at those higher frequencies. It's more driven for military applications at this point. But there is this link that we're looking to put more channels in that are more related to the 5G type of scenarios. That has not been installed yet, but we're hoping to get that off the ground this year. Really, it's funny because I was a part of the millimeter wave lab. I started at ITS as a student working underneath Hans Lieby. Millimeter, it's amazing that this space is coming back. I'm amazed at that. But ITS retired that program probably in 1996. And so we have expertise in that space. I was basically a physicist when I joined ITS, and we still have that here. But we're really excited to bring back the measurement side of it. It's going to take some investment and work.
All right, Paul, you've got 2 minutes.
Tick, tick, tick.
And put your tents down if you're not speaking.
Okay, Mike, as you're looking at some of these interference analyses and things, I think it's great. A couple questions for you to think about. One is, have you broken this up into actually what I look at as the 3 components of interference in the sense of application impact of interference versus the transport layer impact of interference versus the phi layer impact of interference. So we finally can tease apart these things to basically look at technology neutral ways of reviewing this and trying to get ahead of it, so you're not continually revisiting this like, oh, MIMO's here, now I got to do this. Oh, now distributed MIMO's here, now I got to do that. Have you started to break that down into those pieces, or are you still looking at it as a grouping as to interference impact at some level?
We are starting to. We really do, we're the 5-layer lab. We kind of look at energy detection. That's our first thing, right? Is to get into that. We've also just this last year we've expanded our staff to a couple of PhDs in comm theory and that focus on the different layers of this are helping us move towards assessing these other layers.
Yeah, I really recommend you think about that's the space that's moving so rapidly and what's going on in the application space. And we tend to forget that we're all geeky scientists. We always love to work on the stuff that we can do in physics versus doing something that's a little bit squishier, which is the application side. But that's actually where the rubber hits the road. You may really want to.
Yeah, we got to get our QOE guys in with our comm theory guys. I agree.
Okay, speaking of rubber hitting the road, thanks, Mike.
Does that make you the rubber of the road?
Thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate it.
And I would just note that's his audition as a game show host with his microphone that way, so he looks like Gene Rayburn. So with that, we move into the committee outbriefs. We'll start with the 5G subcommittee. Miriam's on the horn. Are you going to be doing the brief, Mark?
Well, I'm going to start off with the status.
Okay.
Miriam is going to go ahead, and
okay.
She's the co-chair, Miriam Saran. She's the co-chair of 5G subcommittee, and she's going to be giving the presentation. But just to go ahead and give the membership a little idea of what the status is. As somebody said before, I guess, with respect to the TAC, we're very focused on sort of actionable recommendations, so we're very focused on that. So far we've had, 5 meetings, and thank you to all of the membership of the subcommittee. It's been very productive. Miriam is going to go into sort of the details, but we've fairly been able to go ahead and provide a lot of detail with respect to our responses when it comes to the recommendation or the questions. And we've been able to have a draft final report. That draft final report has been made available to the membership. Okay, and I guess that's it. I'll turn it over to Miriam.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So this is Miriam Saran from DISH. As Mark said, I think the draft report right now is actually, it does need quite a bit of work. We just wanted to share an interim version with everyone. There are comments back and forth from different subcommittee members that we still are talking about it, and we'll actually go through them at our next meeting. So please consider this as a draft. It will probably change. But we thought to help the discussion over here, we put a few slides together that we've shared with everyone. So I was going to go through the slides and not so much focus on the report at this point. So basically in the slides, the first one is just a repasting of the NTIA questions. On slide number 3, we're trying to say that, we're looking at interference management and sharing in multiple standards bodies. And at this stage, the standards bodies are not necessarily focused on sharing. So there's an exercise that says, okay, what's there so we can leverage it that would help sharing? But I think ultimately, also in the past subcommittees, we've been pointing out that we need to make this a little bit more focused on sharing and try to see if the standards bodies would entertain specific work that allows for sharing between federal and non-federal users, because the techniques that are there are really just enabling the sharing that is within technology, intra-cell, intra-user, and things like that, and they're leveraging they're helpful really for the network efficiency and network interference management, rather than being sort of parameters that you would use to enable sharing between different networks.
Miriam,
Yes.
this is Paige. One thing I wanted to note in this, I'm keying off the words on your slide as well, that I don't want to focus on sharing between federal and non-federal explicitly as it relates to standards. It is more of a generalized sharing techniques or technologies. Understand that your comment, I believe, was focused on looking at optimization, I'll say, and interference within someone's network versus with external or inner network or inner systems. But I just wanted to make sure that we aren't focused on federal versus non-federal as much as general sharing across the board.
Okay. Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate that clarification. But yes, you're right. It's it is really about within a network and basically other users, let's say, associated with a different type of network. So basically, like, there's mechanisms for resource scheduling and things like that within the 3GPP and IEEE standards, but these are not necessarily geared towards different users as much as the same users. Now, they go through like adjacent channel users, but it's still within the same technology level. So basically, when you have an LTE carrier, they do look at what happens with the adjacent LTE carrier, but not necessarily a different technology. That's what I was trying to point out. So basically, that's what we wanted to bring out and see if we can get any feedback or thoughts on that at this point. But that's the situation we're dealing with. So we can pull out, and we're trying to attempt to pull out things that are there already to help. But really, the solid approach would be to actually incorporate things that are meant for different technologies and different networks to share. So that pretty much covers the thoughts on slide 3 and 4 at a high level. And then there's slide 5 is really about deployment. So this is another layer of things. So basically, one layer of things is what's there in the technology, what are the specifications, and mechanisms within the air interface or the network that enable sharing. But the last one is also the deployment, which is distinct. Is how do you deploy these networks, and in more of an implementation of those technologies aspect that also could potentially, be looked at for trying to see how we can efficiently look at the multiple deployment scenarios that, for example, small cells versus macro cells, or basically satellite versus terrestrial, or things like that could also be looked at. So this is a lot of sort of different layers that we're investigating in the subcommittee. So we're going to land at, probably right now, ultimately towards a recommendation to try to account for these scenarios, but as far as actionable recommendations, I think we're going to probably land where we did last time, where there'll be a lot of information there, and now we need to probably figure out how does this information between, CSMAC and the TAC and the FCC and the NTIA efforts, the standards bodies, how is this brought together? Is probably going to be the same challenge that we're going to face, because right now there is not necessarily a path that says, okay, I'll take this, I'll go to this place, and this is where you can get these implemented. It gets a little bit more complicated than that. Going over to the very last slide, this is an example.
Uh-oh. Miriam.
Boy, that communication.
Yeah, we lost her. So, yeah, I can go over it.
Okay. We have Mark on.
Is everybody else on the bridge, or is it just Miriam? Anybody else on the bridge?
We're here.
Okay, cool.
We're on here.
Miriam, you
Yeah,
back?
we're on.
We lost Miriam.
Okay. Mark's here. Yep.
All right, Mark's here.
Okay, so we did have some discussion about this as a proposed NTIA action. The thought is that to actually study sharing, one of the things that could be done is to actually introduce a study item within 3GPP. And sort of the discussion that we had within our subcommittee is actually who should actually do that, whether it should be NTIA itself, or should it be sort of sponsored by NTIA but performed by maybe one of the companies within CSMAC. The feeling is maybe that this may be something that NTIA would actually want to perform. Apparently, NTIA is allowed to submit.
Hey, I'm really sorry. The bridge kicked me out.
Okay, I was just covering this.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
You can add anything. I'm at the point now that that NTIA, it looks as if they do have the authority to be able to submit to 3GPP, and it makes sense that NTIA actually would take ownership over the study item itself. And that here what we have is sort of, some sort of conditioning, and that is you do have to get 4 co-sponsors from member companies, of which I don't think would be a problem. And that, it probably could be useful to actually find within the CSMAC group maybe co-sponsors or something that also are interested in a particular type of sharing as well. And we have here sort of what the next meeting is. If NTIA wants to take this action, then in September there is a 3GPP meeting, so it gives a little bit of time, maybe not a sufficient amount of time, to identify what an appropriate study item might actually look like. But that would be sort of the first opportunity to be able to do that. So as we have indicated throughout the slides, these are just sort of thoughts that we have. We haven't actually come to a recommendation standpoint, but we did want to conclude on something that sort of, kind of summarizes the efforts that we've had within the subcommittee.
Miriam, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just saying on this last slide, we did get feedback from Amy, from our NTIA member of the subcommittee about potentially, issues or challenges with the NTIA proposing work at 3GPP. So I just wanted to mention that that's been brought up. So we really need to kind of go to the next meeting and figure this out. That's why we pegged it as an example. But, it's been done in the past for the FirstNet contributions in 3GPP. The NTI will need supporting members, so we need to also figure out what the industry members that support this work item is. But we think it's a really good way to move forward, capturing what we've been trying to highlight in this presentation.
All right, great. I think we have time for questions and discussion on this topic. So I see 2 questions. Janice?
It's part question, part observation. Compliments to the co-chair and the active people, phenomenal sort of description of the 5G process and the kinds of sharing that it fundamentally addresses. And it's pretty straightforward in saying this is kind of an intra-system, intra-technology form of sharing. Got that. It, however, does lead me to the observation. When you look across study items, we also, in another item, have, very encouraging statements about how 5G is most efficient across broad swaths of spectrum. Fair enough. Also heard the observation, the most important technology. Having said that, as someone who thinks there are very substantial requirements going forward for federal technologies and other commercial technologies, it is striking that, it's interesting that the study, because it was very straightforward and very honest, said, there's a radical difference when you look at LTE or any other robust standard between designing in sharing for non-completely related technologies or bolting them on. And what does concern me, and I think to my mind it needs to mount to some kind of recommendation, that it is crucial to decide how sharing will happen with 5G, particularly because 5G is so ambitious in terms of not just its standards ability, but its desire to acquire vast array of spectrum, which hitherto has been shared. And if you decide not to design it in, you're in this bolt-on scenario, or you're in a scenario of what we currently do, which is geographic sharing. And since many of these other technologies also have ambitions not to be stagnant but to develop, and that's in the national interest, I'm not sure where we as a committee will address that concern, which has to be a fundamental concern of NTIA's, along with promoting commercial spectrum. It's more of an observation, and this is a very, as somebody who wants to learn and contribute, I sit in on all these committees, and when you listen to the discussion, what is presented is a phenomenally ambitious growth path for 5G commercial across myriad bands. But there are a lot of other technologies that, if they're not somehow designed into that picture, will either have to be bolted on or will be in a national debate, band across band, for geography. And I don't know where we're heading with our recommendations, but that's an observation that concerns me, because we're here talking about commercial technologies, but we're doing that in the context of an agency that also has very substantial responsibilities to be sure to ensure that in a world where, number one, there are a lot of other sophisticated technologies that want access to those same bands, and two, we live in a very dangerous world with very sophisticated players, and on the federal side, people need to understand how we are going to use radio waves going forward.
Thanks, Janice. Unless there's a direct response, we'll move to Mark.
All right. Well, I have two questions. One I'll just talk to you offline about. It has to do with the accompanying paper. I just want to ask a question about that. But I wanted just a more foundational question with respect to recommendations. Do you have recommendations kind of that you're working on that you think you'll be able to bring into the meeting in November? How do you feel about that?
Well, the paper does have some draft recommendations.
Okay.
I mean, we had a couple before this point that sort of talked about sort of database and how databases could be utilized as well. So we will have sort of some recommendations. I guess November, is that the time frame? Yeah. Then we will have some recommendations. But in some of these cases, going back to what Janice has said, is that the questions were fairly generic. I think Paige has sort of re-emphasized that we're looking at general sharing versus federal versus non-federal type of sharing. So the answers are going to be very, fairly general. And as we said in the slide presentation, that these type of technologies are going to operate across different frequency bands, and they support different use cases, and therefore will have different requirements like latency, reliability, those sort of things. So all we can bring forward, I think, is sort of what to sort of formulate the question that sort of needs to be answered, in the hopes that we can come to some sort of definition, maybe through activities within 3GPP where you can bring a study item and actually start to get some clarity and bring some of the requirements into 3GPP and let them work in that vein. Of course, that doesn't address all of the other standards organizations, but as we heard, LTE is very important, so that could be a start.
Okay,
so
thanks.
Mark, a couple of things, and getting back to what Paige said in the beginning, one of the degrees of freedom you have here, there's a lot of questions. You don't have to answer everything this year. So pick the things that you guys feel you have the most information, and you can push some of the other stuff out and say, hey, we just didn't get to that this time. So you can choose to focus on what you think.
Okay.
I do agree with Janice. this is a great report. It lists a lot of the technologies, and I think it has a really important statement that, hey, it's really not designed for sharing between technologies. It's kind of designed within.
Yeah.
And so it kind of begs the question, which is actually what should be added? That to me begs the question. We have a couple more questions though. I think Dale, you had your pile up? Or was that left over?
I'm sorry, just very, very quickly, I'm still a little bit concerned that it's really focused on the 3GPP ITU thing, and there's a lot of other activities, I think, that are relevant. Of course, the IETF, W3C, and so forth. But also, I see so much going now on in the open source area. And I think some of the open source things, here again, if you're trying to build capabilities in for sharing, some of those open source projects may have features and functions that could aid it. So I think just focusing on 3GPP and the ITU, as admirable as that is, I think we risk perhaps missing something. And I'm not plugging anything here at all, but Facebook has what they call open cellular now. And they're trying to go to a more open architecture. I don't know will that succeed. Like I say, I'm not advocating or anything, but it seems that we need to think about some of those open source things, which are increasingly important, I think, in this area.
Paul?
Mark and Miriam and your group, when I start looking at this, I'm wondering if you're trying to tease apart, there seems to be some confusion between the mobile and non-mobile or fixed aspects with respect to 5G. Do you plan, I have not read your report, so I apologize if this is actually teased out in there, but if you started looking at the aspects, are you focusing more on the mobile aspects of sharing and what would be the issues, or the fixed? Because I think those tend to get confused and everybody kind of lumps it all together, and I think sharing opportunities in one might be more readily available than on the other. Have you guys thought about that?
Yeah, I can take that. So this is Miriam, and that's a really good point by Paul, and also a good point previous to that by Dale. But it boils down to a couple of things for us. These are all really interesting to look at. There's no disagreement there. One is we could leave them as the next steps if we don't get around to it this time. But our challenge right now is actionable recommendations. So there's a lot of information there. There's a lot of different angles of things that we could look at. How do we turn that into an actionable recommendation and not just necessarily another white paper is what I would really like to get feedback on at this meeting. Because we're going to end up with this last slide actionable recommendation like last time. It is to take one of these standards bodies, and it doesn't have to be 3GPP. That is absolutely correct, but assuming that 5G right now is sort of, there's a lot of activity in 3GPP, it might be a good one. But it's what do we do with all of this information that is a challenge? Mobile and fixed is a really good point, but how do we address that? How do we turn it into an actionable recommendation is the challenge.
That is, we'll solve the problem we can't solve rather than the problem that should be solved.
Anyone want to help Miriam?
Do I want to what?
No, I said, anyone want to provide some help for Miriam there? She asked for a request.
Please. Please, I would really appreciate feedback because we went through this the last time, and I feel it's sort of a deja vu again, and I really want this subcommittee with a lot of the good work and focus and emphasis. And by the way, we do have a tip member from Facebook on there, so that's definitely being looked at as well. But, you know, what we could do to move forward and what we could set in action, I would appreciate feedback on.
Well, okay. I was just going to reiterate what Larry said, what Paige said, which is, you know, if no recommendation is to be had, don't make the recommendation. Maybe you can just define further study that might lead to the recommendation. And I know we're not trying to make more work for ourselves, but this is probably one of the more complicated topics that we deal with, which is 5G, because it means different things to different people, at least in the context of spectrum sharing. So if all you do is parse it and come up with a better way to address it, that's success. I think it is.
This is Paige. So just to add, I think that we need to be reasonable, and I think there may be some actionable recommendations that would come out of this discussion, and I think the members perhaps can provide additional feedback in that regard. I do agree that if we need to tee up a potential topic for this next year, that is okay, though I would like to emphasize that 5G is aggressively moving forward to include the standards activities, and I'd hate to lose a window of opportunity if there are things that we should be addressing now. So do what's reasonable and what makes sense, and that is useful to us in this cycle, and understand that we want to take advantage of the window of opportunity if possible. I would also say just a quick comment in general. Though the reports are helpful, I wouldn't focus too much time just on writing a report. It's really, are there recommendations that we can wrap context around versus generating, I'll say, a large report. Though the information in the reports are always helpful, just want to ensure we aren't diverting too much resource and time just in writing and editing a report.
All right, I think we're going to move on to the next subcommittee. Was there someone on the phone that had a comment there?
Yes, this is Jennifer. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, because I was listening to this discussion, and it sounded like there were time constraints associated with different possible recommendations. Would that be relevant to note where any recommendations that come out of the group have any time constraints on them being meaningful to do?
Yes. Let's move on.
Okay, that would be my request.
All right. Thanks, Jennifer. Before we move on, just something that comes to mind personally, I don't know if this is helpful to the subcommittee. It just feels like 5G is going to try and use all these different bands, and these different bands have different things in them: radar, fixed, satellite. I don't know if there's expertise on the subcommittee to address any particular of those use cases. We say, well, how should 5G share with, fixed terrestrial or satellite or radar? That just comes to mind for me when I read this stuff.
And just a reminder for those on the phone, if you're not speaking, please mute. I think that's why Jennifer sounded somewhat duckish.
Okay, with that, we're going to move on.
I didn't need to know that. Thank you.
We just wanted to defend you from sounding duckish.
We're going to move on to the next agenda item, which is the key characteristics, but we have neither Charla nor Tom.
I think Charla's going to do this.
Charla's on the phone?
Larry.
Okay, great. Charla, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry that I can't be there in person. I had some family commitments that I couldn't get out of, so I had to stay here in D.C. And my co-chair, Tom Dombrowski, couldn't be here at all. So it's just me here as the co-chair, but there obviously are several, I think almost all of our subcommittee members are on the phone or there in person. So what I'm going to do is run through where we stand and what our thinking is, and then to please ask fellow subcommittee members to speak up and add anything that they'd like to do. They would like to. As you may have noticed, our report is very short. I realize now that we probably could have made it a little bit longer by actually including the questions, which we didn't. I'll review them very briefly for folks in case you don't have them with you. But what we decided last week, in fact, we were actually writing a report, and to Paige's to Paige's point, we were writing a report, but we were writing it in large part so that we could use it to generate discussion on how we might answer the questions and what kinds of recommendations we might make. And what we decided is, while we knew, as most of these reports are, it was in draft shape. As we were going through sort of back and forth on it, it became clear that several of us felt as though the answers to the questions didn't really address all the different possible industry players, and by that I mean we can't be comprehensive, obviously, but there was clearly somewhat of a bent more toward terrestrial services, particularly mobile, and the idea is that we want to get more in each of these areas and be thinking about them before we actually share it with the full committee. It's not to say, some of the questions actually did deal with it probably better than others, but as I said, we just felt that the timing was good in terms of sharing it before we actually had a chance to go through and really deal with those issues a little bit more closely. We intend to do that very quickly, not waiting till the next meeting, and we're hoping to be able to get something out to the committee well before November. When Tom is back from vacation, what he and I will do is call a meeting and then also try and do this. We've actually accomplished a fair amount through email as well. So walk through my notes here. So basically what we did do is we put before the committee 3 recommendations, and we would really like to talk them through. I think even among some of us, there might not have been full agreement on the nature of the recommendations. They more or less follow the first 3 questions, so we have recommendations on the first 3 questions, but not the last 2. So what I'll do is I'll read the question, and then we can talk through the first draft recommendation, and I'll do the same for the second 2. So the first question was, from an industry perspective, what are the key characteristics it considers in evaluating the desirability of a particular frequency band as a candidate for licensed, exclusive, or shared and unlicensed spectrum? And then we also got feedback through Amy from Paige that she was interested in having us look at the relative priority of those characteristics, not just the characteristics themselves. So you can read this, but basically what we as a group looked at as being critical to commercial industry were propagation coverage, capacity, contiguity, international harmonization, and incumbency issues. And we did actually take up Paige's question, but there was just a lot of back and forth on that. And I think we'll take it up again just to see whether we can hone in. But what we came out with was that, in fact, the relative priority for the characteristics is likely to vary based on industry, and actually even within industry on use case. So that. Again, Paige, to address your issue, I'm not sure that we're going to have a better take than this. Although, quite frankly, this is actually, I believe that if we kick the tires on this, both here in this meeting as well as back when we go back to our subcommittee, I think this could actually be a useful part of the recommendation. I don't know how you want to handle this. I can stop now and let my subcommittee members chime in, or I can go through all 3.
Charlotte, why in the interest of time, why don't you cover the brief, and then we'll do discussion and comment.
Okay, great. So second recommendation, is fairly straightforward. We recommend that for either repurposing or sharing, that the government actually look at contiguous spectrum. And this is harder to show without the background. But what a few of us did from satellite, unlicensed as well as licensed point of view is we went and looked at various technologies and looked at the key key components of both, you know, what you gain from having contiguous spectrum. And again, there was a question that Paige raised, and it may have lost something, Paige, in translation, and I would like to actually, you know, have you walk through it, that had to do with, you know, putting this in context. And we looked at that, and we're, you know, somewhat, you know, we were a little bit, we were having to make an interpretation of what that actually meant. So what we were interpreting it is whether, for example, the need for contiguity changes depending on bandwidth or frequency. So, you know, when I'm finished here, that would be helpful, Paige, to have you sort of talk about that, and again, you know, my colleagues. The third recommendation, and this is one I just wanted to be clear that, you know, the language is pretty, you know, NTIA should not attempt to rigidly define blah, 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 you know, low, mid, and high band spectrum. And sorry, I forgot I was going to read each of these. Question 2 was, what are the technical and operational impacts of contiguous versus non-contiguous spectrum to satisfy commercial requirements? Question 3, the one that I'm on now, is when industry describes its need for low, medium, and high band spectrum, what should we understand to be the definitions of those broad frequency ranges and the rationale for selecting the boundaries between each? I think, you know, one of the comments, and clearly, you know, we'll think of a better way to say this in the final recommendation, but you know, certainly as we were looking at this, and everybody around this table knows this, is that you know, several years ago, if you had talked about low, mid, and high frequencies, it would not be the ranges that we're talking about now, and certainly not, you know, mid-band spectrum would not be what the Commission just adopted in its NOI, 37, you know, 3.7 gigahertz to 24 gigahertz. So, you know, and one of the issues we were looking at is saying when you talk about a band like that, as a mid-band, you know, clearly the propagation characteristics and just the way that it can be used, even the availability, the incumbencies can change dramatically when you have such a large range. So one of the things that we're looking at, you know, is again that we're not 100% sure how helpful it is. You know, in some ways that those definitions are, you know, they're being used by us, they're being used by government, they're being used across the board. But you know, we're struggling with just how useful they are definitionally, whether we should actually be, for purposes of answering the question, you know, which is the rationale for selecting the boundaries. We were even looking at potentially, you know, making them more than having more than just 3, you know, low, mid, and high. Maybe even looking at ranges where there is a little more commonality in propagation characteristics. So we don't have recommendations on the final 2 questions. Question 4, to what extent does the channel bandwidth needed for any given deployment vary depending on whether deployment is low, medium, or high band spectrum? Obviously, that is somewhat contingent on what we recommend for 3. And question 5, what commonalities and compatibilities between federal and commercial applications could be exploited to maximize the potential for sharing between federal and non-federal users? These might include, for example, applications that coexist technically and or operational or common technology. And the lack of recommendations there is not, you know, it is not an evidence that, you know, there hasn't been work done in those areas. I think we just haven't really been able to reach any conclusion yet. And again, as I said, our plan is to you know, take the feedback we get here and then move forward, you know, fairly quickly and trying, you know, to finish up the report and potentially come up with recommendations for, you know, to hone these recommendations and come up with new recommendations, or to the extent that Larry had said earlier, you know, perhaps recommend that some of these things need further exploration. I'm not saying we think any of them do at this point, but that I heard that, and if we think that makes sense, we'll probably recommend that. So that's my description, and turning it over to some of my cohort. If anybody has any comments, if I left anything out, if I misrepresented what we're thinking, please comment.
All right, Charlotte, I think Paige wants to make a comment first.
Yes, Charlotte, I want to address, I think, a couple of items. The question on context, and this was particularly relevant to the key characteristics for commercial deployments. Obviously the key characteristics as defined have trade-offs, particularly propagation and coverage versus capacity as an example. So the context was related to how we consider these key characteristics associated with perhaps, I'll say, use cases or unlicensed versus licensed or other applications, different kinds of technologies, just to help us as we try to apply these key characteristics in our own processes of looking at bands for consideration. Also, the part of the intent of the question of low, mid, high is to help us prioritize where we focus our resources in this resource-constrained environment. So as we look at the needs across all of those bands, what does that look like in terms of projected requirements, and how do we define those bands? So as we look at options that we may want to focus resources, how we prioritize those smartly. So that just gives you some additional background, I think, in terms of the intent of
actually, that's helpful, and particularly the latter, which I think fits in with some of the description I gave as well. Because if we narrow, that probably is helpful to you as well. As if we narrow, say, mid-band 1, 2, and 3 kind of thing, as opposed to 3.7 to 24 gigahertz.
All right, are there other questions and comments? I see one from Dennis.
Hey, Dennis Roberson. On this third point, the recommendations and the comments you just made about low, medium, or mid, and high bands, I'm just going to really hit this point an additional time. These have been so fluid over the years that even though we've just put out an NOI in the mid-band and redefined it once again, it's really becoming less and less helpful, in my mind, to make these distinctions. I think we're better served just to put out numbers and characteristics of bands in the way you described it for applications, rather than try to artificially create low, mid, and high, because the terms don't have any meaning anymore, at least from my perspective, just because they're so fluid and they're so different in different time frames and different based on the way the technology has evolved. So things that we only thought we could do with low band, where low band was kilohertz, if you go back far enough. Dale is laughing because, yeah, it has really, really, really changed, and I think it's very, very artificial to use that terminology.
Yeah, I think what we're hearing is, focus on what band should they focus on instead of naming.
But,
and
there
are numbers that are
individual bands, but I'm
frequency
looking
ranges.
at kind of ranges, because we understand that there are evolving requirements across everything.
Right.
But we can't focus on everything. So helping us prioritize our resources. And I fully agree that the assumptions we made, 5 years ago on bands and applications, et cetera, have changed in some cases very dramatically. So we don't want to get locked in. It's just a matter of how do we help prioritize our focus.
And that's the point, just to recognize that. I mean, if you go to the physics, since I do have a physics degree along the way, there are things like water absorption, where water absorption hits, and oxygen absorption bands, and things like that that are fixed. But beyond those kinds of things, much of the rest of it is really, really very fluid.
Well, in terms of what will help you versus what will help Charlotte, I mean, that's where we need to make the connection,
Right.
Charlotte and the committee. So, I mean, we could talk all we want to about what this means. I mean, 100 years ago, high band was kilohertz, so, you know,
Yeah.
it changes with the times.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's helpful, just, you know, Paige's comment in particular about the resource constraints and where to focus. And then Dennis is on top of that suggesting, you know, that it really isn't about, you know, again, I kind of had to, when we started talking about midband, again, I was like, well, what do we mean by midband? Okay, great. We'll call that midband now. But it wasn't, not even like just a year or two ago, wouldn't have been that high.
This is Jennifer. Could I get in the queue?
Go ahead, Jennifer, you're up.
Great. I also think that focusing on band ranges is important because of the fact that this approach varies significantly by subsector of the industry. So high range and mid range haven't varied as much for the satellite industry as, you know, the shift within the wireless industry. But more importantly, internationally, none of this translates, whereas band ranges do. And if we're going to be talking about harmonization and scale, I think that's a better opportunity for alignment. So I would support this change. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Donna?
Yes, Donna Bethea-Murphy from Inmarsat. I agree with the previous speakers that each band has a different propagation characteristic. So maybe we talk in specificity associated with propagation characteristics or bands, and assuming everyone knows what the propagation characteristics are, those are associated with those. But I think that when we're looking at sort of, you know, writing a bigger document, we have to consider and I know we're trying to bring this to a higher level, but I think when you look at the service, the applications, the coverage, and even if you're talking about, let's take, for example, a satellite service. Well, you could have a mobile satellite service. You could have someone providing broadcast within the mobile satellite service or broadcasting within the fixed satellite service. And I think each time you look at the characteristics, the dynamics with sharing or, you know, how you can fit other services in changes. And I do think it's interesting as we look to sort of make everything the same, even if we're not looking at worst cases like Julie was talking about before. If you have a frequency band where you have lots of different applications in there, what you may be doing is rewarding the one system that was built instead of being built to sort of maximize the use, the one system that is built sort of, you know, at the mid-level. So I think that this is this group has an interesting task, and I think that there are a lot of things that we need to look at to put out something that is usable, that someone can make a decision about. And I think that we will have to get a little bit into specificity as opposed to sort of generics. Thanks.
All right, any other comments on the phone? All right, thank you, Charla. That was great. And I guess, Charla, anything else, or we'll move on?
Nope, that's it. Thanks.
All right, with that one, we'll move on to the enforcement subcommittee, and I think Paul's going to present. Am I correct?
Well, yeah, my cohort, I think, is also on the phone right now, Mark Crosby, but...
Yeah, I am, but you have the con, Paul. Go ahead.
Okay, which means I can blame him.
Means many things.
Okay. This group has been struggling a little bit and trying to get some momentum going. There's been some meetings going on. We're trying to be different than the previous, actually some of the questions that were asked were different than the previous enforcement committee questions. And so we were trying to address, how to, some of the technology, some of the possibilities that are out there for doing enforcement. What are some of the technology pieces, and what are some of the things that are going on in the 5G world that are unique for enforcement that should be brought on? Those are essentially the questions that you asked, and sort of asking what do we recommend to try to do to move forward in the automated enforcement area. And you can see here all the members. We've had, everybody's been involved one time or another in some of the meetings. If you go to the next slide, how we kind of broke it up as a group, and I'm just going to go quickly through this, was simply to bring out, in a sense, 4 different groups. One of them to look at the background area and ask the question, hey, what has been going on in enforcement? How is enforcement being done? How is automated enforcement being done at the present time? And trying to link back into other studies that are going on, so it's not simply we're trying to recreate and repeat other work. The other aspect was then, okay, what is currently out there today that we can take advantage of with respect to enforcement and automate the system? So what's like right now available? What's on the market? What's out there? And what are the ramifications legally and policy-wise? Because that would be sort of like the near term or the low-hanging fruit in the sense of trying to look at for enforcement. Group 3 was trying to look at, hey, what's really technically possible? And what is out there that if we actually started bringing into the system, that would sort of try to build up new automated enforcement mechanisms, which at the end, I think what you're looking for is trying to understand how you can use automated enforcements to push sharing to a new level. And that's really what your goal is. It's not really just to enforce the mechanisms, but right now we tend to build enforcements or rules for sharing based upon that there is no enforcement mechanism, so you have to actually be very conservative and try to back off, versus if you have some automated ways. So all those corner cases that we tend to look at, how do you, if you can automate those out, now you can actually be much more aggressive, I believe, in the enforcement process. And so that's where this group 3 is trying to ask, what can you do there? And then group 4 was trying to look at, hey, what is the 5G specific? And you're going to hear a little bit about some of those aspects. We've met a few times, as I said, look at everything you have here as a work in progress. This is an interim report. This is when we talk about recommendations or findings, they have not been thoroughly vetted by the group. We're just getting to that point. So take these with, as I say, as a grain of salt as we move forward here. So don't sit there going, what? You're thinking of this? But feedback as to areas where you may not have been looking at that we should be looking at, I think it would be very valuable right now. And I think the rest of the committee, as we get done with this, feel free to jump in and kind of expound on a little bit of some of the ideas we were putting out here. The status, as I said, we're doing these preliminary findings, and these are raw materials. The next slide. So the activities, we've had multiple meetings. We've actually developed a bibliography of prior work thanks to the Group 1 activities. We have a list of references and contacts where they've been looking, and you'll see a little bit later on, trying to talk to interference hunters and the like, and trying to understand a little bit about how they're doing it to see how you can automate some of those processes. And we're talking to equipment manufacturers of what is possible. If you go to the next slide. So the preliminary findings, and this again, preliminary should be double, triple underlined, okay? First of all, which is kind of interesting to note, is that most companies hire consultants. They don't, at least the smaller companies, to find their interference. When they have a problem, they actually hire out. Some larger companies, like I would presume the big wireless carriers, will have internal teams. But in general, all the other players are all looking at some individuals, like your interference hunter people or whatever, to go out and find that. And they break up the interference into really the 3 types. One of them, which is, believe it or not, one of the biggest cases is intra-system or self-interference. We find that out a lot. The other one is just somebody, one group, one item, one person, one emitter causing problems. So you're just trying to find that emitter. And the other one, as we talked about before, and Julie was looking at, is the rise in the noise floor, is that all of a sudden we're having a problem in general here. It's no longer a very specific find that. So when you talk about automated enforcement, and you look at somewhat in the AWS 3 band, and I've been involved with this, it's almost like a widespread when you're seeing a whole noise floor rising up because of many, many users integrating together. You have to look at that differently than you can look at, hey, there's just a hotspot there and I need to be addressing it. So we find that. We also find out that really there are limits, and I invite some of the committee members to comment on this later. There's a limit to what consultants can actually do. There's only so far they can go in a sense of locating people and tracking them and the like due to legal or policy issues, especially in the privacy area and ability to access particular locations so they can determine what's really going on. So in overall, just even using these kind of mechanisms, if you don't find some way of automating it, you still are going to have to bring in outside teams from the regulatory agencies to actually to have the ability to break through these privacy and access issues, or you're going to need policy changes to allow that to occur, and that's a sticky wicket. Automated systems tend to be also applying just to current waveforms. So basically, people build systems that do Wi-Fi hunters, that do, looking for cellular bands and all this stuff. They don't build systems that actually cross the board and actually can use waveforms that aren't standardized. And so therefore, if you're actually trying to locate somebody who's using a waveform that is not using one of the standard waveforms, you have a tough time at this. And so therefore, there's a whole technology buildup there. Instead of using energy detectors or using something actually much more sophisticated, you're going to need much more sophisticated technology to be able to to find some of these people who are using waveforms that are not standardized waveforms. The next slide, some of the evolving challenges that are happening, giving that as a backdrop. Essentially, you're getting to smaller and smaller cells, so now it's no longer just a big stick looking for who's interfering associated with them. It can be in so many different characteristics. You have to somehow understand how to break those up. As we were saying, even though they're smaller cells, they're getting closer together, and that the capacity and latency constraints now, interference now could be on latency, not just on pure dropping something out. And the like. And this actually goes to some of the questions I was asking the ITS folks, which is how are you looking at interference. And some of the new challenges that are going on in the 5G world, the whole area of device-to-device communications is now coming up. And so now interference associated with the device-to-device is something that probably many of us are not thinking about. We also have to deal with what is interference when you have adaptive arrays. And considering that is now being employed not only in the high-frequency bands, but it's actually in distributed and non-distributed MIMO systems is actually becoming more prevalent. And you also have the systems are already doing dynamic framing, which means that when you're trying to actually understand what interference is, you have to put in the context of how it's changing its frame sizes, which actually indicates what kind of interference you're actually getting. And so those are kind of the new challenges when you're trying to go into automated systems. But the good news is there's new capabilities in a sense is that as we go to 5G and these higher band spectrum, there's a lot of bandwidth to be had that maybe you might be able to glean off a % here, a % there, which gives you now a better capability of actually distributing the information around to be able to do enforcement. Next slide. So again, now that was 3 underlines of preliminary. This is the 4 underlined part of preliminary. And that is, one of them, and pretty much the group has been talking a lot about this, which is how do you get best practices or databases of what people have found out before to be used by future users, future interference hunters and the like. People have built up techniques. In fact, a lot of them are willing to share those techniques. Okay, but the question is how do you get a database together so that people can say, hey, this is how I found, how you can locate this kind of interference source and the like. And that's actually a pretty straightforward type of process. The question is how do you actually host something like that? The next one is how do you actually look at transient interference cases and the impact of transient interference, okay? And the idea is to somehow find a way to study that, because everybody tends to look at if it's a 1 microsecond, 1 nanosecond, is that interference? Is it 1 second interference? Is it 1 second, every second for a half a second for 10 minutes? Is that interference? What are all these duty cycle issues? And this goes back to the application and in the transport phase, not actually in the PHY layer anymore, and that actually gets a lot more complicated. So it makes you recommending maybe a study in that area. Trying to also require a machine-readable report for interference detection systems. So basically, how do you standardize the methodology to actually provide the information about interference? One possibility is that when you start to do sharing, do you actually put in the policy or in the technical rules to enable kill switches or pause transmission switches? Or we've talked about in previous times beacon IDing an ID capability. So the idea is that you do that in the 5G as you actually to aid in this machine-to-machine interference diagnostics. Also to look at analyzing the different enforcement stages of automation, all the way from, it's not that you have to go all the way to the step of, listen, this is the person who's interfering with me, this is how they're interfering with me, but actually looking at, first of all, I want to find out I have interference. How do I report that process? How do I report what the impact of that it is? How to report, the characteristics of it? How to report maybe the spatial characteristics of it? So how do you go up the levels instead of just saying enforcement is everything? From the beginning detection stages all the way up into the shutting it down of the interferer. And finally and these kind of all tie together, how do you build an automated enforcement architecture? Because that actually is how you're going to be able to fit all these pieces in. And with that, Mark, would you like to add any additional comments?
You did a great job, sir. I think my comment, I think we covered in the last two bullets. I think one of the issues that we have or challenges that we have is I think it's easier to work with interference mitigation. You can identify and you can figure out where it is, and but it's not malicious, right? So interference mitigation is, in my opinion, not enforcement. It's maybe a lower piece to it, but it's not an enforcement activity. And sometimes we also get discussions into, well, we're doing enforcement when we have automated means to maintain the integrity of systems. Yeah, that's important, but again, I don't think that's enforcement. Enforcement is when somebody or a group of people or one person or even vendors, equipment can come in that's not type accepted, or there's malicious or maybe not malicious, but rules are broken. Then you got to fix it. That's enforcement to me. And so I really want the subcommittee to, maybe with Paige's comment, I know interference mitigation is important, but I don't view that personally as an enforcement. Enforcement is when somebody breaks a rule on purpose or by mistake, but you go after them and you fix it. That's enforcement. And I sort of also been spending a lot of time reading Dale's emails, and Dale's right, in a lot of respects. What are we enforcing? I mean, is this? Should we leave it alone? The parties will take care of it because they were, the speed limit's 55 and they were doing 50, or enforcement's when somebody's doing 90 and the speed limit's 55. I think the subcommittee's doing great work. I think we have a lot more to go, and further clarification and guidance from Paige, I think, at this time, and other members of CSMAC would be helpful.
Okay, Mark, I'll chime in. This is Paige. And I've said this in past sessions, so I'm going to repeat it here. When I use the term enforcement, I use it fairly loosely and broadly. It's not just the traditional enforcement definition or mechanisms as you described, but looking more holistically at how you even prevent interference. Something's about to occur and you can prevent it, or you identify and then resolve it. So I've always talked to that term of enforcement, and in context of this subcommittee as a broader context, particularly as you look at automated capabilities that you might want to inject into I'll call it the infrastructure more broadly. I also wanted to just ask a question in terms of, and this is probably a step too far, but as you look at this problem set, as you look toward the future, and things like dynamic spectrum access, software-defined radio, software-defined networks, then how does that change the dynamic, for no pun intended, or the framework of what you might be looking at as well?
Correct.
That's a great question. One would think that, and listen, I'm no technologist in this, but one would think you'd be able to embed those type of devices with very sophisticated hopping and interference mitigation type of software inside those systems and those devices. And one would think, but again, maybe I'm a dreamer. My only other comment is, but Paige, I love talking about things like kill switches, and things, which is really hardcore enforcement. But, I appreciate it.
It's hardcore anytime you say kill anything.
Yeah, I know. I mean, again, I like that, Mark, though, and
sometimes
but I understand.
Sometimes they call that stop buzzer, but if you want to go full, metal jacket, call it.
All right, Mark, if you don't have any much, we have a lot of tents up here in the room, so
I'm done.
Let's move that. I think, Mark, you were actually the first tent.
Yeah, so I wanted to make a comment. I said this before. I think you've got some SAS people. I know I'm on this committee, although I've missed the calls, so mea culpa. I think Paul's on the committee, and I think Kurt's on this committee. You're going to have an excellent example of how this is going to work in the context of SAS, CBRS, and ESC. Because right now, in fact, probably in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be meeting with the Commission to talk about enforcement in the context of SAS, and we're talking about interference reporting and enforcement in the context of ESC. So stay tuned. I'm not sure if we'll be able to feed anything back in terms of recommendations by November, but that's playing out exactly in CBRS along the lines of what you're asking about, and Mark mentioned, it's not enforcement until you break the rules, so that's an interesting concept. We're trying to put the anti-enforcement on some of what we're doing, so that breaking the rules means we don't interfere with ships coming on to aircraft coming on to aircraft carriers. I'll leave that as it is. So we'll try to feed that back to you in the context of calls, but there'll be a lot coming out of that.
Well, that said, I presume then you're going to be very actively participating in Group 2, because
Yes.
that's actually the group that you say, this is the technology today, this is how we're employing it, and this is its challenges associated with that.
Yep.
So I'll count for your input.
I'll be there.
And Russ.
Brian.
So as Brian Chairman, I have two quick things. One is when we did one of the prior enforcement committee activities, we drew a distinction between ensuring compliance versus taking enforcement action, and it might be a useful distinction to continue to draw from a taxonomy perspective about the compliance versus enforcement. So that's one. Two is whenever there's a bullet that starts with mandate about technologies, they break out into hives. And one thing I would just, as a comment.
Remember 4 underlines.
Understood. There's a lot of salt here. I know, very small grains. But is that for everybody to think about where the incentives align here, and Dale talks a lot about incentives, and are we really talking about a mandate, or are we talking about a situation where compliant companies will do these things because their incentives align to do so, and then relatedly, companies who want to break the rules won't comply anyway, so it won't matter. So there's a bit of a cross connect about how you think about mandates and incentives aligning. You don't need one if you have the incentives aligning. And indeed, the people who will break the rules will break the rules. So just try and think about that. And I always am nervous about any mandates that have any specific technological capabilities associated with them. So I just wanted to add that cautionary note.
Thanks, Brian. Dale.
A real minor thing, but it seems to me, talking about waveforms and shifting waveforms, we've had emission designators in the past which have been useful in enforcement. If you see an FM, this is a silly example, you see an FM signal, an AM band, kind of tells you, hey, there's something going on. So we've used emission designators. I'm not sure what they mean anymore. I think there might be an interesting recommendation come out of this that would be look at the role of emission designators in a situation now with software-defined radios. You can be changing those waveforms on the fly. Finally, and I apologize for being a broken record here, but I still am extremely concerned about the spoofing and jamming issue. We've had this recent issue on GPS that, again, these systems, radio systems are inherently open. You put them in a Faraday cage, they don't work for their intended purpose. And we've got, I think, in talking about the enforcement thing, is to look at people who, with using the evolving technology, can both spoof and jam. And I don't think the reactions, it seems to me the architecture of the design of the enforcement system, I think, has to change a little bit when you think about that threat vector.
Thanks, Dale. Michael.
Michael Calabrese. On recommendation, preliminary recommendation number 3.
4 lines preliminary.
Right, exactly, 4 lines. Talks about develop a machine-readable report standard for interference detection results. And I'm wondering if, does this suggest development of standardized metrics for collecting interference detection results? And if so, I mean, which I think would be probably very useful, but if so, does that then go beyond, for example, the mechanism of a database to work in bands where monitoring is the mechanism, and perhaps even monitoring by the incumbent, but if it's in a standardized way, then it can be shipped over to the FCC and they actually know what they're looking at.
Right. This specific recommendation was not on how do you standardize the measurements, but more on how do you standardize the presentation of that information. Okay, so the two are intertwined, but I just want to make sure we're not telling people this is how you make measurements. It's more of, if you can tell us what the noise floor is, if you can tell us what you're measuring and how you're measuring it, then at least it can be brought in together versus telling people, mandating, not mandate, sorry, not bad term, suggesting standards with respect to how you make the measurements or how you do it. So this is the idea. It's almost like building a messaging format that we do for a lot of things. You have to make sure that the messages can be read by everybody and can be understood by everybody.
So the goal would be a degree of standardization?
Yeah.
And
on the reporting, not on how you report,
Right.
how you report it, not what you report.
And then in terms of mechanisms, are you focusing on monitoring, spectrum monitoring as a mechanism as well as databases?
Well, yeah, we're definitely spectrum monitoring, but we haven't gotten to that point yet to figure out what any kind of recommendations are for spectrum monitoring. So,
Okay.
good idea. I mean, good point. We just haven't gotten to that point yet in
Yeah,
the
I was
discussions.
just thinking that maybe the combination of those standardized metrics and monitoring could,
Oh, yeah, that's
perhaps work in more places than the database mechanism where you can get the kill.
All right, Rick, you had a quick
I just
one?
want to amplify. Some of these things are related, and so we have some things about cleaning up, and not to hammer on the mandate thing, but one of the ideas is to actually, as a part of the equipment authorization and licensing system, to have requirements for there are certain features that would be implemented in devices that would get authorized in the future. So one of the things could be you have to provide a report. One of the things you do if you're going to have a certain class of service or certain rights, in order to have those, you would be told you'd have to provide that as a part of your device and be able to report in. We've talked about this in terms like tethered and non-tethered systems, and there are systems like that today. If you take a look at the way the TV white space works and this whole business we're doing with the 3G, the 3.5 gigahertz, those are very similar kinds of things. Now, I guess you kind of walk down this method or this thing about whether it's a mandate or not, but if you tie all those things together, it's very, very powerful.
All right, thank you. I had a few things. Just what strikes me is it seems like the general problem is super hard in enforcement. So it just seems like, is there kind of is there some low-hanging fruit, some easy wins, or is there like an if-then statement? If we did this, then we'd unlock a whole nother level of sharing between systems or something. I just fear that the general problem is super hard. So I'd look for the low-hanging fruit, or what can enable, maybe 3.5 gigahertz is a good if-then. If we do this, then we can do that. So that was some of mine. Anything else from the phone? I want to make sure we give the phone people an opportunity to comment before we move on. Okay, not hearing anything. Either the phone's disconnected or there's no comments. So,
Or it was a brilliant presentation.
we'll move on to the last of the subcommittees to give a briefing today, which is the Spectral Efficiency Group. And I assume, Brian, you're going to be presenting? Or
That's right, and Jennifer will correct me as appropriate as we go through this. And, so we're the Spectrum Efficiency Subcommittee. Our list of members is on the second slide. We were given two questions, and Carolyn has the lead on the first one, and I had the lead on the second. So what additional regulatory, procedural, legislative, or policy actions could be implemented to improve spectrum efficiency without harming effectiveness, including enhanced funding options for federal agencies, one. And then two, what practices, technical and otherwise, has industry adopted to optimize its efficiency across disparate networks that might have useful lessons for NTIA and federal agencies? So Carolyn's going to talk us through the answer or the work done so far on question one, and then I will take it over on question two.
Okay, so for question one, we had a overall subcommittee kickoff Then we focused on outreach, and we had some discussions, planning on how we're going to do the outreach. Our subcommittee developed some survey questions, both for OMB as well as for the federal agencies. So we first conducted targeted outreach, focused on the management regulatory side to date. And so the point was to use these responses to inform our questions and the dialogue then with the federal agency. So to date, we've received some input from NTIA, specifically ITS, on their metrics effort, and also conducted an interview with OMB. We then had the subcommittee provided some input. We had some brainstorming, discussions about preliminary recommendations, and then decided that we did need to have some more interviews to better understand the implementation side. This rounder discussion would help inform all elements of this topic. So we then reached out to federal agencies with focusing on implementation of regulatory, procedural, legislative, and policy actions. We reached out to DoD, FAA, NASA, NOAA, and DHS, as well as to conduct some follow-on discussions with ITS and OMB, specifically their Office of Federal Procurement Policy. So that is ongoing. Then that will be followed up with our report and recommendations. So we're keeping an open mind, considering many options. This slide lists some of the considerations that we're discussing and thinking about. This includes further expansion of the Spectrum Relocation Fund. This would be applicable in limited situations when there's a case for auctions, because that's how the SURF is replenished. In other cases, we're considering devising mechanisms for federal government to share spectrum without giving up their assignments. Some preliminary considerations that we've talked about is considering recommending a focus of another CSMAC working group on federal mechanisms to monetize assets on a non-permanent basis. This could be a follow-on effort. So we're also talking about spectrum efficiency metrics, leveraging the work that ITS is doing. We're talking about agency accountability to current and additional guidance and policy and regulatory requirements, but recognize that there are some resources that need to go along with it. So considering making a recommendation about any policy or recommendation or change should be accompanied with sufficient resources and staffing to properly address it by the agency. So if there's a requirement, the agencies have the resources and staffing available to address that properly. Also considering the various federal incentives and proposals that are out there, considering a macro level kind of systemic look at both federal and non-federal options such as sharing and property rights, as well as combinations of all of these different proposals.
Can I ask a question before you go on? Are those considerations based on the survey and the interviews, more or less?
Based on that, as well as our subcommittee discussions.
Okay, good, thanks.
And I'll turn it back over to Brian.
Great. So as you can see by the framing of the questions, the first question was really focused on federal users. The second is focused on industry practices. And so we've been working since, I guess that's April, on a variety of responses here. We began by developing a series of 14 questions that we developed as a group and shared with all the CSMAC, so you all got that. Those questions were finalized. We solicited inputs on any changes to the questions. Then we sent out the questions to every member of the CSMAC, as well as any non-members of CSMAC that people thought would be useful to get feedback from. And we now are presenting the sort of state of play right now is we have, and we're going to go through briefly, the responses from those questions so far. We would like to plead with other members of the CSMAC to respond if you haven't already. We've heard from 6 so far, and we appreciate that very much. Our responsive friends, but others have been less responsive, so we would love to hear from more of you because the report will be stronger the more people are in it. The results are anonymous. We concluded that was the best way to ensure the best feedback. And so we'll now proceed through the 14 questions. I am not going to detail the answers Instead, we just sort of gave taglines. The real reason we decided it would be useful to have these listed with you all this morning is so that because it might trigger some of you to respond and say, oh no, that dynamic load balancing is ridiculous, we should never have government do that, or what have you. So it's supposed to prompt some thought on various members of CSMAC to respond. So what practices, technical and otherwise, has industry adopted to optimize its efficiency across disparate networks that might provide useful lessons for NTIA and federal agencies? And so here you see, and once again, anonymized across the 6 responses. And that we did have, and I didn't touch on this, but it was on the slide, we had manufacturers, service providers, broadcasters all participate. So we do have a good diversity so far. Did somebody have something on the phone? Okay. 2 is what future practices has industry planned or considered to enhance efficiency? And here's another, once again, robust set of responses from our members. Then we went to, and now we walked into the mess of what is low, mid, and high band, but nonetheless, industry has emphasized the need for access to all that stuff in order to be able to meet customer expectations. How does spectrum efficiency play into the needs for this access to spectrum across the range of frequencies, and what bands are used to provide which services? So sort of tailoring it down more narrowly from the prior question. And what should these types of frequency requirements apply to government? How should these types of frequency requirements apply to government users? So how has spectrum efficiency improved as we move across different generations of service? As sort of an analogy to what federal government users could do, what other methods have you used to increase network efficiency? It's basically a catch-all. What difficulties have you encountered when such transitions occurred? Commercial users have gone through a series of transitions to more efficient technologies, which have included substantial investments, and they've been doing it while continuing to meet the needs of their customers. That would be the same type of transition that the federal government would need to use in order to maintain its mission-critical function. And so the hope was that there would be some lessons learned from the commercial side that maybe the federal government users, because of the lack of resources, have not had the opportunity to learn those lessons yet. How do you go about phasing out less efficient technologies? This is particularly interesting, I think, from the commercial side, where command and control of your customers is not always available. You can't, Steve can't go to all the customers of T-Mobile and make them give back their phones that are inefficient. And so the challenges on the federal government side are different here.
Eventually we do.
Well, perhaps, yes, we have had that. Well, anyway, that's a whole different story. Exactly. Encouraged, strongly encouraged, but they can use marketplace incentives to do that. Yep. Only that one time. But anyway, at any rate, so the challenges are different here, and we recognize that, but we thought that this would be useful to get some of this from the commercial guys. Number 8, as a manufacturer or commercial service provider, what incentives do you typically need to offer customers to incent them to switch? As we just talked about, here's a free phone. And do you think such incentives can translate from commercial to government? Are there differences in efficiency advantages that can be gained based on the size and frequency of the blocks of spectrum? So one of the things that we wanted to be cognizant of is that some of the experiences, for example, of LMR, et cetera, in lower band and narrower frequencies is much different than you might have in a fixed microwave band or in a CMRS band. So we didn't want to overgeneralize on the differences in frequency advantage or efficiency advantages across those systems, and we're trying to capture those distinctions with this question. Some recent allocations and spectrum decisions are based on the use of database, which we've talked about. How is industry anticipating this type of controlled spectrum access to impact overall spectrum efficiencies? And are these technologies something the government should be developing? So I think there's in exclusive bands as well. I think we recognize this question is capturing some shared learning between commercial and federal, but to the extent that commercial entities have knowledge or experience that may not be completely transparent to the federal side, we wanted to try and capture that here. How important will unlicensed offloading continue to be for meeting future spectrum use requirements? Here too, recognize it doesn't map exactly to federal users, although it does have a certain QoS analogy, if you will, in the sense that when commercial systems traditionally turned unlicensed, they recognize that they may be getting lower QoS in some cases, and they may be getting less security. And so are there ways in which that same set of considerations may translate into federal users, and therefore maybe have some lessons that might be useful to them? What's been the biggest obstacles? So this is an open-ended question, and how is industry overcoming them? And you see a few of them, the trade-offs between cost and power, regulatory restrictions, and refarming, the loss of efficiency during spectrum refarming sprang up. But this is one where we would like to get some more feedback if we can before we get to the final report. Are there other lessons learned? Once again, a catch-all that has application for federal government users. And finally, is there anything that you commercial users, as you sit here, efficiency gains that governments could readily achieve that you're aware of? So they're the low-hanging fruit question. So those are our 14. More is better. We would love to get more inputs or feedback on these inputs. Our goal is to take the next 4 to 6 weeks to get more responses in, including non-CSMAC members, if you have suggestions on other people we should go to. And then we will push all this into a report that looks more like I think like a catalog of things that people have given us, as opposed to some of our other reports, which tend to be more narrative with more editorial control, is our plan. So I don't know, Carolyn, if you want to, is there anything else on your work plan? I think we kind of detailed that already.
Right.
Jennifer, anything I messed up?
Nope, not at all.
Whoa. Whoa. Mark your calendars. All right.
I'm just
Exactly, only today.
Well, you know, I know how you feel about the schedule.
Well, you have a job, isn't it? If you give up telecom, doing the voiceover for TV.
It's the unfortunate part about billing by the hour, by the way. I talk too fast.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments for this group?
I have a quick question, and maybe just you said this at the end. Do you see recommendations coming out of this, or more work coming out of this? And I mean,
I see a catalog of answers to those questions coming out of this, and I feel like the challenge, and Paige, maybe you can shed light on this now, is we're, especially on my question, that may be less true for Carolyn's, we are trying to come up with a list, sort of a catalog of things. You can only assess how useful they are in terms of lessons for the federal government side, and so I feel like the way the workflow would probably be most logical is for us to finish, NTIA to come back with places where they think the suggestions actually have some merit, and then maybe there's more interchange of information across that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I would also add that if there is some sort of, I'll call it prioritization, but things that have made the biggest difference on the industry side that we may want to focus on initially as part of that discussion.
And the trick for us is that we just, because they're coming in as inputs from across multiple CSMAC members, getting that comparative is going to be tricky, but I hear you, and we'll see if we can prioritize.
Dennis Roberson here. Well, how are you trying to address the challenge that spectrum efficiency is in the eye of the beholder? I mean, there's the classical, being an academic, there's the classical bits per hertz per square meter or cubic meter, depending on your perspective. There's that kind of metric for spectrum efficiency, but that doesn't apply when you're in a specific case. Spectrum efficiency for public safety is very different from spectrum efficiency for cellular, commercial cellular, and it's very different for satellites than it is. So how are you trying to deal with that? Since I've fought with this now for a long time and still don't really have an answer that I'm very comfortable with, other than going back to the academic side, and I can hide behind that one. But
well, and you're channeling our initial call. So we began our initial call by saying that we are not going to relitigate what the definition is of spectrum efficiency, that we were going to take the definition that had previously been adopted by CSMAC in one of our earlier working groups and just use it, because we worried that it was an infinite regression for all the reasons you just outlined.
Yeah. Okay.
And if I could, I think what we're also going to do as we're talking to the federal agencies that are the operators is let them define for us how they want, and we'll incorporate that so that it's more mission specific or agency specific. We've run into this discussion already with one of the agencies.
Yeah, let me make one comment about that, because I'm setting up these some of these agency interviews, and so you have this OMB definition. There is a definition, in the OMB thing, and they say, "What the heck is that?" this is how that we're going to hear about what they think spectrum efficiency is. And it's interesting, I think, that all these people we're going to talk to have a different idea of what it is,
Right.
and they're all doing it to some level, but it's not on some kind of uniform mass thing that the OMB circular says.
Steve?
So, I think to Paige's point on what's been most effective, and one of the things that I guess I don't see in here is there's a lot of kind of focus on technical implementation of what drives efficiency and techniques that are used. But one of the things that, at least from the commercial perspective, I would say has really driven efficiency are economic incentives. And, that may be something that should be worked into here. How do we do that? I mean, it's difficult to force somebody to implement a specific technology or technical approach to it. And I think that's the whole basis of an overall economic incentive approach. And I know we're looking at that in other areas for federal users to promote sharing or to do other activities, but it may be something that we should work into this report as an effective mechanism to help drive efficiency.
He needs to respond to the survey, right?
I can't confirm or deny whether he has. I think we were trying to capture that a little bit with question 8 about what incentives commercials uses to offer customers, but it's a fair, maybe we just need to, and it also as well as expanding it maybe under, you were looking at the number 13 or 12, I think at 12. But 8 talks about what you do as a commercial provider to incentivize customers to switch to more efficient technologies and how they translate, so maybe we can put some more stuff in there.
Yeah, because I think it's different of what we incentivize customers to do versus how we, what we do as far as densifying cells or transitioning into new technologies because it's more, right, because it's more efficient, yeah.
Jennifer, do you have a comment?
Yes, I was just waiting for an opportunity. I think the discussion that Steve's raising is part of what will be discussed in Carolyn's subgroup, because it's a question of what is the trans-applicability, if you like, of that concept. And I have a feeling that's where we would have that discussion.
Well, I personally think this first task is very interesting because we had in the past with the adoption of the Spectrum Relocation Fund, and it was really powerful. And I think finding other powerful means like that is a real opportunity, but obviously difficult. So I think it's interesting. Any other comments from the phone on this topic? Paige, did you have any?
No.
So I think, thank you very much. Thanks to all the subcommittee members as well as co-chairs. We have definitely gotten feedback, and we're definitely aware that it's been a tough go. We kind of started late. We didn't really get all these things launched until mid-April. And we asked for interim recommendations here in August, which is really over the summer. So we realize all that. It's a very compressed timeline. So again, we're going to ask now for November to consolidate into a final set of recommendations that the NTIA can react to formally. I said it earlier, but we'll say it again because we've talked about this as a group, that there's certainly freedom to say, hey, this is something we don't have a final recommendation on. We recommend, continued work. Please have something for, each of your subgroups, but there's definitely it's not necessary to cover all the questions that have been put in front of you if you feel that some of them you just don't have good answers for and you want to focus on. So that's definitely a degree of freedom that's available to everyone. But with that said, we are going to still shoot for this it's kind of been this one-year experiment where we're going to try and get a wrap-up by November, and then what we'll do is embark on next year with a refreshed set of topics, perhaps some carryovers. Again, with that, thanks also again for everyone getting everything in on time. It made it very, very easy to go around this time. With that, I think we're at the section where we have opportunity for public comment. We have a commenter. I don't know if we have a mic available or the...
Comment at the front, Mike. We have a mic. Well, 2 mics.
No. Mike, what's the mic?
Up to the front.
For the G-Maker.
And please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mike Marcus, a retired FCC employee and occasional professor at Virginia Tech. I've also been very interested in the specific issue related to this conference of spectrum above 95 gigahertz, which I assume qualifies as millimeter wave for discussion. And I hope some people can stay around for my paper tomorrow afternoon on this issue. But let me make one point, for example, on propagation. A key issue above 95 gigahertz is protection of passive satellites in NGSO orbits. The key propagation model for that is ITURP 676, and there is no publicly available software to do that. NASA has an internal implementation they won't let other people use. May I suggest that ITS either make a copy themselves or get NASA to make theirs publicly available, but in order to engineer that. But more importantly, above 95 gigahertz, all the spectrum is GNG shared, and there has been a lot of friction in how to move above that. Chairman Pai has publicly said he wants to move above 95 gigahertz. I would urge this committee to consider in the next iteration to look at the special problems above 95 gigahertz, where sharing is very, very different than at lower frequencies because the physics is very, very different. I do not begrudge the cellular industry more spectrum. There are mobile allocations there. The mobile allocations should stay there, but there are no service rules for anyone above 95 gigahertz, and while the discussion in this group about commercial has seemed to be only for cellular, there are other commercial NG users other than cellular, and they should be given access to spectrum above 95. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Other public commenters? Do we have any comments on the phone from the public? Oh, wait, we have one more in the room. Is that correct? No. Someone waving to Jan. Again, anyone on the phone from the public desire to comment? Okay, with that, we'll close the public comment period. We have an opportunity now on the agenda for remarks from the co-chairs. I think I made my remarks. One of the things I think has been helpful for the group, and this is a comment for the liaisons, feedback from the liaisons has been particularly helpful in refining what is important to each of these subcommittees. So I encourage and thank all the liaisons from the NTIA that have been doing the work. I think that's been very, very valuable, and they've also produced some feedback from these groups that have helped us have visibility. So again, I just wanted to thank the liaisons for their work and encourage their further good work. Mark, do you have any other?
I'd only like to reiterate what I said earlier, and that is that, first of all, the liaisons and working with NTIA has always been good, but with, again, I'll use CBRS as an example. The collaboration that's been going on has been just remarkable, and so I'd like to thank everybody that's involved for the driving to success. I mean, it's been complicated, it's been difficult, but we're all moving in the same direction, and I think that takes a shared goal. So I say on the dais, thank you. That's why I'm standing up here. So thank you.
With that, unless there's any other comments from...
Yeah, just thanks to all. Again, we really appreciate your inputs and your sage wisdom. So thank you very much.
Enjoy the ice art.
And that will be adjourned. Thank you.
You want to indicate the next meeting time?
It's in November.
Yeah. I don't think a date's been locked in. David, do we have a date?
It's in D.C. Yeah, Dave, are you soliciting venues? If you're not, don't talk to Dave. All right, thanks everyone, and hope you enjoy the clips. The eclipse.
Thank you.
I was...
I hear you speaking. I gotta go.